Where is Saudi Arabia in all this? Have they just pretty much given up their, thrown up their hands?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. The Saudis have thrown up their hands. And this is part of the reason why they tried to get this deal done with Israel before the Gaza war and why they will be right back at the table the minute the war ends. They badly need this deal. They need it the way you and I need air to breathe. They understand that they are under threat. Everyone in the region remembers what happened to Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded. I don't think we would have rescued Kuwait had it not been for the fact that we needed the oil. The Saudis understand that. So in 20 years, when we probably no longer need that oil, and of course we'll be buying and selling oil for decades, but you're going to reach a tipping point where there's supply of 100 million barrels a day and demand of only 80 or 85 million barrels a day. And at that point, oil, the pricing is going to crash. We're not going to need it. And the Saudis are understandably afraid that if they get attacked at that point, what is America going to do? And that's why they want this defense deal so badly.
What's the ultimate goal of the Houthi rebels?
Everything gets back to Iran. They have this wonderful strategic weapon. And those who think that this will end when the Gaza war ends, I think are fooling themselves. Iran has this strategic weapon. They're going to utilize it whenever they feel they want to, whenever they've got some sort of confrontation with the United States or perhaps with Europe. This is not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when will will consumers worldwide, I mean, is this going to affect them for years to come?
I think it will. 12% of trade goes through. It's called Bab el-Mandeb. It's that narrow choke point going into the Red Sea and then ultimately the Suez Canal. Egypt is, of course, going to be very affected by this. The Suez Canal is a very important source of foreign exchange for them. And I have to say, this goes back to the reason why so many people opposed the Iran deal. If you go back to the Iran deal, the JCPOA, the core bargain was that Iran would not make a bomb, but they would get to do everything short of making a bomb, develop all that technology and even a missile capability to deliver a bomb. But the real key was Iran would be allowed to continue to engage in these proxy wars all over the globe and not have any sanctions, still be embraced as a normal member of the international community. Now look around the world today. You've got Hamas engaging in the worst butchery since the Holocaust. You've got Hezbollah shelling Israel, militias attacking Americans. Now the Houthis disrupting 12% of global trade. And this is with Iran under sanctions. Imagine what would happen if Iran was not under sanctions. You would see this on steroids. So this is the reason why it probably, and it's a close call, I admit, because Iran with a bomb is no picnic either, but probably the better course is what a lot of people, and not just opponents of President Obama, it was even, for example, Senator Schumer, opposed the Iran deal, and this is why. The other thing is, and it's a painful thing to have to say, but we're going to have to start living by the golden rule, or at least the golden rule as it is applied in the Middle East, which is to say, we got to do unto others as they are doing unto us. And like Iran can wage proxy wars against us, we got to start waging proxy wars against them. There's no shortage of groups opposed to the Ayatollahs. Even inside Iran, you've got a lot of minorities there. There are Baluchis, there are Azeris, Turkmen, Baha'is. Maybe there'll be some shadowy group that starts to target Iranian shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, or maybe there'll be some shadowy militia in Iraq that fires a drone into Iranian oil infrastructure. It's not a pleasant thing. Nobody wants a wider war or any war, but this is probably the only way you're going to get any kind of results.
All right, well, assess for us the prospects of a wider war at this point and whether or not within the Biden administration that is considered to be something that's even politically palatable.
Nobody wants a wider war. Nobody in Israel wants a wider war. Nobody in Washington wants a wider war. But we do seem to be inching in that direction. It doesn't seem like on the other side they want a wider war either, but it's very, very hard to gauge intentions. I just want to point out as an aside, how did Israel get caught so badly by surprise by Hamas? The answer is that you only plan for attacks you consider to be possible, not for attacks you consider to be impossible. And the best analogy is the 1972 Munich Olympics. Nobody thought that anybody would up and attack the Olympics. And if you had said something to German security officials before, they would have said, why would somebody do that? Well, it turned out somebody did do that, the Palestinians. Here we are in a situation where Israel was supplying Gaza. Israel supplied Gaza with most of its water, its food. They gave the Gazan Palestinians 5.7 billion gallons of water just in 2022, without which they die of thirst. 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, food, clothing, baby formula, electricity, fuel. 18,000 Palestinians worked in Israel to earn money to pay for all this. Israel was literally the only country in the history of the world supplying its enemies in time of war. Nobody thought Hamas would blow that up. Nobody thought they would cut off their only economic lifeline. Nobody thought they would commit national suicide. And make no mistake about it, they commit national suicide. Those 18,000 Palestinians who used to work in Israel, they better get their resumes together because they're not coming back to Israel anytime soon. Gazan Palestinians are now going to become wards of the international community, living on humanitarian assistance, not unlike the Arabs in Syria, in Idlib. And nobody thought they would do that. And Hamas officials are giving interviews and they're saying things like, well, we don't want to live, we just want to kill. And no one really,
All right, just because of time, we're going to have to wrap it up. Yuri Kaufman, author of 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War, How It Created the Modern Middle East. Let me give you a quote on crude oil. We'll start with the international benchmark, which is Brent. That's up, 1.6% right now, up $1.22. Below 80, though, at 78.62. And West Texas, that's up 1.5%, 73.09 a barrel. You are listening to Bloomberg Markets. And that brings us to 11:33 on Wall Street. Let's get an update on world and national news. And with that, Amy Morris joins us from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, John. Thanks so much. The risk of a wider war in the Middle East is in focus today. The U.S. and U.K. launching dozens of airstrikes against Houthi militants in Yemen. And President Biden says he will take more action if necessary. Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says high tensions are leading to the risk of a wider war.
There's a lot going on at the moment and a high tension environment. And so the question is, at what point, if any, do some of these Iranian proxies tip things over into a full-scale conflict? At least the initial interpretation from these airstrikes overnight is that it's not designed to do that.
The Houthis responded saying all U.S. and U.K. interests are now legitimate targets for them, saying that a strike would be imminent. Mishaps with Boeing and Japan Airlines are drawing fresh scrutiny of the airline industry and safety procedures. Lawmakers want Congress to act on a 5-year bill that reauthorizes the FAA before it expires in March. Meanwhile, the FAA is also increasing oversight of Boeing production and manufacturing, auditing the MAX 9 production line and its suppliers. Voting begins for real in the Republican presidential race Monday night when the first-in-the-nation caucuses get underway in Iowa. Caucus goers will have to contend with a polar vortex on their way to the meeting halls. Wendy Schiller is director of the Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University.
People who are super enthusiastic about Trump, which tends to be the Trump supporters, are going to get out the door to show up in person to express their support for Donald Trump. It's part of how they feel about Donald Trump. They want to be known for supporting him. Whereas, the supporters of DeSantis and Haley are the people who are against Trump. How much are they motivated to get out the door in the really cold weather? But I do think Iowans are fairly hardy.
Brown University's Wendy Schiller spoke on Bloomberg Daybreak, and recent polls showed Trump with 51% backing in Iowa. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you...
connection lost.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. I'm Nathan Hager. Stocks are moving a touch lower as we head toward the lunch hour, but the big moves are in the bond market. We are seeing buying for treasuries after producer prices came in with an unexpected drop following the stronger than expected consumer price index that we got yesterday, though. Global head of macro at Wells Fargo, Mike Schumacher, says investors need to keep in mind there could be a slight risk that inflation sticks around longer than they might like.
There's at least a chance you get core inflation in the U.S. that sits in the high twos. And in Europe, it doesn't approach 2%. And then what? What do you do if you're a central banker? We don't know. They probably wait and watch for a good 6 months and then say, do we really have to come in and hike again? We don't want to do that, but we can't really come in and ease. I'd say the chance of that's probably a 10, maybe 20% chance, but it's certainly material. People have to think about it.
And you can hear more from Wells Fargo's Mike Schumacher on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast, but those producer prices are firming up bets in the market that a March rate cut could be on the way. So let's check the markets as we do all day long on Bloomberg. Right now, the S&P is down 6 points, or about 0.1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average down 213 points. That's a drop of 0.6%. The NASDAQ Composite is down 18 points, or 0.1%. The 10-year Treasury is up 6/30 seconds now. The yield at 3.94%. The 2-year at levels we haven't seen since May, down to 4.14%, a drop of 10 basis points for the policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury. 6 of the 11 main industry groups in the S&P are in the green right now. Energy and communication services are the biggest gainers, and right now we're watching NYMEX crude. It's still up, pairing some of its earlier gains, but still higher by 1.6% at $73.19 per barrel. COMEX gold is up 1.9% at $2,056.60 per ounce. The euro 1.0964 against the dollar. British pound 1.2750. The yen at 144.77. Bitcoin right now down 5.5%. Down to around 43,600. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Bloomberg Markets continues with John Tucker and Lisa Mateo.
All right, Nathan, thanks a lot for that. We appreciate it. Nathan wrapped up there with the Bitcoin quote. So let's pick up there. The Bitcoin ETFs, the trading. That was a groundbreaking day yesterday, Lisa. And who better to wrap it all up for us and tell us what's going to happen next? Katie Greifeld from Bloomberg News, our Bitcoin ETF guru. So we're calling it an historic day. Is that a correct label?
I think it's fair to call it that. Groundbreaking, watershed moment, etc. Those are all words.
You're basing this on volumes or what?
Yeah, there is actual data to back that up. So let's go through some of it. So we had 10 ETFs come out the gate yesterday, spot Bitcoin ETFs, and it was pretty amazing. You look at all told what the trading volume looked like those 10 ETFs clocked in $4.6 billion of turnover. Most of that came from the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, $2.3 billion. That's a little bit of a funky situation because that has existed in a trust structure since 2013. So it had all of these built-in assets. So you were expecting a big bump from GBTC converting. But even, I mean, outside of just GBTC, to see almost or approaching $5 billion of turnover, that was pretty breathtaking, I would say.
Now, you're saying all this, but then we're looking at it now. I mean, has it faded? How would you describe about what's going on today?
Well, if you take a look in terms of Bitcoin's price, for example, as I understand it, and let's pull it up right now, Bitcoin not having a great day, currently approaching down 6%, below 44,000. What happens next is really exciting because the question that everyone has been asking
We're going
is,
to tie these to futures, right? Or what's the next step here?
well, futures ETFs have Bitcoin futures backed ETFs. We're talking about future or options.
We're going to talk about derivatives, I
Yes.
guess. Okay.
Yeah. The next step would be that options begin trading on these spot Bitcoin ETFs. But if you think back to when the Bitcoin futures backed ETFs launched in October 2021, it was the ultimate sell the news moment. Bitcoin reached $69,000 a coin in the aftermath of those ETFs launching. There's been a lot of questions as to whether we were going to follow the same script this time around, and it kind of makes sense that you're seeing Bitcoin fall in the aftermath of this much anticipated debut, given that there's just so much hype priced in.
With the debut, we also had something of a price, or at least a fee war among the majors. What happened there?
We, in the words of Eric Balchunas from Bloomberg Intelligence, we had about 2 years of a fee war condensed into just a couple of days. Issuers were already cutting prices on these products before they even got out the gate. And we're talking about extremely low numbers. I mean, the lowest price was Bitwise's spot Bitcoin ETF at 20 basis points. I believe Franklin Templeton one-upped them just today and is now 19 basis points. So we're just seeing this march lower and lower. And there's a lot more urgency to this fee war. I mean, fee wars are really common in the ETF industry. This one is a little bit different and a little bit more urgent because all of them launched at the same time and they all hold the exact same thing. So how do you stand out? And the answer so far seems to be by just trying to offer the lowest price possible.
And some of them are doing it only for a few months, and then those fees will start to kick in.
That's the other thing. That's one of the sort of marketing gimmicks that's come about is that, a lot of the issuers are just waiving fees altogether for the first 6 or 12 months. Invesco, BlackRock, ARK, and 21 Shares are some of the firms that are doing that. That's an interesting move because if you think about the bull case for these products, who's actually going to buy these spot Bitcoin ETFs, the answer has been RIAs, it's been those sort of institutional players who maybe didn't want to handle the futures funds and they're not going to go out and buy Bitcoin, just direct Bitcoin. They don't really care about waivers. What they're really concerned with is the eventual fee, since that's what they'll be charging year after year after year. The fact that they're waiving fees suggests that perhaps these issuers have just pure play retail in mind, people just buying this in their brokerage accounts.
Okay, so if mom and pop want to dip their toe in the waters, is it safe? Are the guarantees there from the regulators?
I'm not sure how to opine on that. I will say the fact that the SEC finally gave
And it's
their
not
blessing.
it's not like you're putting your Bitcoin or your money with a platform like FTX.
Well, so you think about all the issues with FTX that would be avoided by the fact that, these are spot Bitcoin ETFs. And when it comes to, having to deal with, digital wallets, things like that, storage, having to manage your keys, that is all taken out of the equation. That's being handled by the issuer. So that removes that headache. And that's why, a lot of advocates have been saying this is a game changer, that this will open up a new class of investors to come into Bitcoin. Maybe they haven't wanted to worry about all of that, all of the technicalities, and now they don't have to.
Now, you have a lot of reaction from people that you talk to, too, in the business. What's the reaction? I mean, are investors getting involved? I read something, was it yesterday or the day before, that Vanguard said, you know what, we're not going to put this on our site. So what's the reaction that you're hearing?
Vanguard is an interesting one. And some of the brokerages saying no, Vanguard sort of leading the way there, has been really interesting to watch. I will say Vanguard, if you know Vanguard's personality as a firm, it's not too surprising. I mean, a few months ago, I asked them, you haven't filed for a spot Bitcoin ETF application. Do you have any plans to? And they said, no, absolutely not.
Right,
so
right.
probably not surprising. We'll see if some of the other brokerages follow suit. I mean, they're available. They are trading on a lot of the brokerages, Schwab included at this point. So it'll be interesting to see if some of the other brokerages follow Vanguard's lead or they take the Schwab route.
Okay, minute left. What's the next big event in crypto land?
I'm really looking forward to the 3-day weekends. I gotta say, that'll
No,
be
that's
pretty
not
fun.
crypto land. That's you.
That's
In
Candyland.
crypto land, we haven't gotten full flow data for these funds. That will probably take until later today or Tuesday. We know the trading volume was really high. It's going to be interesting to see what that actually translated into in terms of money coming into these funds.
Don't you love it? She was just like standing out in the hall. We needed a guest.
did.
There's
She
Katie.
came
Grab
to our
her.
rescue.
I was about to call my mom, but this works too.
Tell her
yeah.
we
Well,
said
tell her
hi.
we said, yeah, right. Katie Greifeld, everything a Bitcoin ETF. Let me give you a couple of quotes. The iShares Bitcoin Trust today, down 5.75%. What's the other big one? We'll do the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. That's BTC. That is 6% lower right now. As for Bitcoin, that is down 5% right now, 43,839 per token. You're listening to Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker along with Lisa Mateo. And right now, let's get an update. Company news. And for that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, we have shares of Citigroup down now less than 1.5%. That's after the firm announced it will eliminate 20,000 jobs. The cuts are part of CEO Jane Fraser's strategy to boost returns. Citi expects to save $2.5 billion. But in the meantime, the firm will incur as much as $1 billion because of severance and expenses related to Fraser's overhaul. BlackRock makes a big play for a piece of a growing market. Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini has details.
BlackRock has agreed to buy Global Infrastructure Partners, or GIP, for about $12.5 billion, and BlackRock will pay $3 billion in cash and about 12 million shares worth about $9.5 billion at yesterday's price, and that deal is expected to close in the third quarter. This catapults the world's biggest money manager into the top ranks of investors that make long-term bets on energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure. The acquisition of GIP, which manages about $100 billion, is the biggest deal in more than a decade for BlackRock. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks, Denise. Shares of BlackRock down less than 1%. The U.S. government is stepping up scrutiny of two telecom companies. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti reports.
The EPA is ramping up its inquiry of telecom giants AT&T and Verizon after an investigation found that old lead-covered cables had contaminated waterways and soil in parts of the U.S. A trade group that represents both companies said test results continue to show that telecom lead-covered cables pose no significant public health risk.
Thanks, Gina. Shares of AT&T and Verizon stock are up less than 2%. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker, along with Lisa Mateo, and for Matt and Paul. As we look at markets right now, S&P 500, 6 points lower. That's down about 0.1%. 40.73 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 204 points lower. The NASDAQ 100 is down 23 points. That's down about 0.1%. And it is 11:55 on Wall Street. Right now, let's get an update of world and national headlines. Amy Morris is in Washington. Good morning,
Right.
Amy.
Thank you, John. The U.S. and U.K. have launched dozens of strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen in a bid to stop the Iran-backed group's shipping attacks in the Red Sea. Bloomberg's Bill Ferries with more.
It looks like the U.S., U.K., and their allies hit more than a dozen targets in Yemen, believed to be used by the Houthi rebels for everything from like radar facilities to weapons depots, places where drones could be assembled and stored for launch, as well as sites holding ballistic missiles.
Bloomberg's Bill Ferries reporting there. The Houthis appear undeterred. They say all U.S. and U.K. interests are now legitimate targets and the strike is imminent. House Speaker Mike Johnson defied a rebellion on his right flank. He says he'll stick with the spending deal that he made with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Our top-line agreement remains. We are getting our next steps together, and we are working toward a robust appropriations process.
Now, this move lowers the risk of a government shutdown, but it does threaten to jeopardize Speaker Johnson's grip on the speakership. The House will vote to hold Hunter Biden in contempt of Congress next week. Republican Majority Leader Steve Scalise making that announcement. The president's son defied subpoenas to testify behind closed doors. He has offered to only testify publicly. A polar vortex is about to unleash an Arctic blast across much of the U.S. over the weekend. Some of it's already hitting Iowa. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn is tracking this.
Low pressure continues to lift out of the central United States. It'll produce rain across the Ohio River Valley, the deep south, and also the Gulf Coast. Some of the storms in the Gulf coastal region and also over the southeast may be strong as the day goes on.
Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn tells us there's also snow with this system, and blizzard warnings are in effect from Minnesota into Illinois. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. John and Lisa.
All right, Amy, thanks very much. Appreciate it. It is 11:57 on Wall Street. I'm John Tucker, along with Lisa Mateo. We're in for Paul and Matt. And what do you have for us, that big smile of yours?
This is what we're talking about. So we had a couple of talkers. This is a new trend, okay? So sleep unders are the new sleep over, okay? So they're also called lateovers. Here's the problem,
What?
okay? Parents.
Is this some sort of politically correct thing
No.
you're talking about?
No, it's parents.
Because I've had my fill, Lisa.
I'm sure you have. No, they're getting anxious about their kids staying in someone's house to sleep over. I personally was one of those. I was not allowed as a kid to sleep over anyone's house. I kind of passed that on. My kids, they're not allowed
And look
to
how you
sleep
turned
over.
out.
Yeah, I'm okay.
I didn't say that.
But I was the hated mom because I always had to drive up and, pick up my kid before the sleepover was over. So
Just when the fun was getting
I'm
started,
just
you
kidding.
got to come
I'm
home.
sorry. It's how I grew up. So a lot of parents, so what are they worried about, right? They're worried about gun safety. A lot of people talking about that's a new conversation you have to have when you drop someone at someone else's house, when you drop your kids off. Technology use. So they're picking up their kids early. Here's something else, a new trend, John. It's called a mommy and me sleepover. So the moms come and they sleep over with the kids. So that's a new trend.
Does that mean that dads like me get a rest?
Yeah.
Because
you
if
get
that's the
night
case, I'm all
He's
for
all
it.
for it. Of course you are. But so the experts are saying the sleepover gives kids this opportunity for some real independence. The parents get the night off if you do the sleepovers. The parents who are overly, though, cautious with sleepovers are usually overcautious with other things, and that can lead to anxiety problems for the kids. That's another side of it. But, each kid is different. Some kids don't even like sleepovers. So
Well, that's the highlight of in my family. The oldest one didn't want to do it. The youngest one was out the door with her little backpack, saying
she's
goodbye.
ready to go.
See you in a week or
She's
whatever.
Had it with you.
It's another
Sleep
thing to worry
unders,
about.
John.
Sleep
Sleep
unders.
unders.
All right, I'll try to keep that in mind. S&P 500 right now, 7 points lower. You're listening to Bloomberg Markets.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
And good afternoon. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Lisa Mateo. We're in for Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller. And as we wrap up the trading week, we've heard from some of the major banks. The earnings picture presenting a stark contrast between J.P. Morgan Chase and everybody else. Oil higher as Houthi rebels promise a response to U.S. and U.K. missile strikes. Bond yields lower after today's producer price index coming in lighter than expected. 47.96, Lisa. That's the magic number on the S&P 500. Still a ways away from that at this point. Keeping a close eye on the record we set 2 years ago. Let's start off with your market update. And to do that, here's Charlie Pellet. Hi, Charlie.
Well, hello there, John Tucker, and here's what's going on. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red right now. Treasury two-year yields hitting the lowest since May as an unexpected decline in producer prices reinforces bets on Federal Reserve rate cuts this year. S&P right now down 8. That is a drop of 0.2%. We got the Dow down 220, a decline of just about 0.6%. NASDAQ down 0.4. NASDAQ 100 index lower by 0.2%. Two-year yield at 4.15% with a 10-year 3.95%. Gold up $18 the ounce right now at $20.47, a gain of 0.9%. We've got Bitcoin now slumping 5.8%, 43,502 on Bitcoin. Crude, major story. Brent crude now at $78.40, up 1.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude traded here in New York, $72.89. That is a gain of 1.2%. Bank stocks front and center for the most part. In fact, they are all lower right now. J.P. Morgan Chase after earnings down 0.4%. Citigroup after earnings down 1.4%. Wells Fargo after earnings down 3.3%. And Bank of America now lower by 2%. Citigroup, by the way, says it will be eliminating 20,000 roles in a move that will save it as much as $2.5 billion. Bloomberg's Allison Williams, an analyst, bank analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence, has been breaking down the numbers, and she was a guest this morning right here on Bloomberg Markets.
I think the most important takeaways are things looking more positive for J.P. Morgan and less so for Wells Fargo, and that's a combination of the net interest income outlook as well as the cost outlook.
And again, JPM down now by 0.4%. She alluded to Wells Fargo down now by 3.3%. And yes, you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. John and Lisa, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, happy Friday, Charlie. Thanks a lot. Let's get a look under the hood now. Stocks on the move, companies to watch. Bloomberg equity reporter Nora Melinda joins us right now. And I'm looking at the laggards in the S&P 500. Almost all of them are airlines.
Yes. I mean, it feels like the broader market has been all over the place today, especially with PPI and as investors are really digesting all of this data from bank stocks. But the one thing that has pretty much remained consistent has been airline stocks. They are the biggest laggards by percentage in the S&P 500 today. That's mainly led by Delta. Some Delta earnings came through with Delta backing away from its 2024 profit target as persistently high costs counter the gains from a rebound in international travel.
Now, they also had, isn't Delta also like they did an order to place Airbus? They had a big Airbus order too.
Right.
So, I mean, how does that react as far as shares? I mean, does that affect it at all?
I mean, I think that like a lot of things have really been in focus for Delta and airlines more broadly. Of course, like we're looking at like these higher fuel costs, like that's really been weighing on Delta and along with a lot of these other names. Boeing backlash and all of that that's been happening with over the past week has also been weighing on the sector more broadly. So I think that like this is really something to watch as we progress through the session today, but seeing them as the biggest laggards is really interesting as you think about travel dynamics.
Is there any bright spot with the airlines? I mean, it's just... I know Paul's
I only bring
flying
bad
today.
news.
All right. Speaking of bad news, let's move on to the next stock.
Yes.
United Healthcare shares Tumbling right now, 518.36 down 21.32.
Yes. United Health, that's falling kind of right behind these airlines, down as much as 4.9% today. That's the most since June. Health insurance stocks are tumbling after the industry leader United Health reported higher medical expenses than analysts had initially expected. And this is major news for the sector, just simply off of the fact that it's a sign to investors that the sector may not have accurately priced in for how many people are getting medical care now, that many of the general public essentially aren't thinking as much about COVID and a lot of these other things that would have obviously benefited these health insurance names.
So what are they? Is it higher care expenses? Or what,
yes, I mean, like executives at United Health did say that they planned for things like seniors getting orthopedic and cardiac procedures to persist. But a year-end uptick in costs driven by RSV vaccinations and COVID care doesn't appear to be durable or relevant for the rest of the year. That's the CEO that said that. So those shares are really tumbling as people kind of think about the broader landscape of health insurance companies.
And they're like the industry bellwether.
Exactly. Right. Not the best news for Friday.
All right. For the Friday, the big news today, of course, some of the financials we got today. And one of the highlights or lowlights or whatever you want to call it, the difference between J.P. Morgan Chase and everybody else. You also had lots of cuts being announced at Citigroup, where Jane Fraser trying to reorganize that bank into something else.
Right. I mean, bank earnings have really been in focus today, and specifically, as you mentioned, Citi has really been the headline of the day. I mean, the CEO, Jane Fraser, said that it was a very disappointing fourth quarter. So, I mean, how are investors really supposed to take that? But the firm did also announce that it's going to cut 20K roles in the medium term. That should hopefully save the company as much as $2.5 billion. So we'll definitely see how that plays out. But as we mentioned earlier, these bank shares are down as everyone's really digesting the news and the earnings results as we kind of look at the broader landscape and how the financial sector is faring amid a challenging backdrop.
At 47.96, that's the number to watch in the S&P 500. I've been watching it 2 years ago. That was the record. We're at 47.73. Boy, that last mile is really tough at this point. We just can't seem to get there with that record.
So much back and forth.
I know. All right. Well, it is Friday, so that's something.
We'll see where it settles.
Nor always good. Deeper look at some of the stocks that we're following today with Nora, United Healthcare, Citigroup, as well as the banks and the airline stocks. Nora Melinda from the stocks group. Thanks a lot. We appreciate it. That brings us to 12:08 on Wall Street, and the Israel-Hamas war does seem to be broadening out. The U.S. and the U.K. striking back against Houthi rebels who've been targeting shipping in the Red Sea. And now the Houthi are vowing to strike back. Oil higher as a result. Let's take a deeper dive into the story. Look also at the political fallout. Wendy Schiller, professor at Brown University, joins us now. Wendy, thanks for being with us. We appreciate it. Did the Biden administration have much of a choice in its response? And what's the worry about how deeply we may or may not get involved in a broader conflict?
Well, I mean, I don't think the Biden administration had any choice. I mean, obviously, we are a major superpower, but we also have very strong commercial interests in making sure that commercial carriers can, use shipping lanes unaccosted. We've had issues with piracy in the past in other parts of the world, but this is, reminiscent of conflicts that we've had over the years, the last 50, 60 years. And it reminds voters of our dependence on foreign oil and the globalization of the energy market. And so I think that's where Biden has to sort of figure out how to sell this to the American people as important to the United States, but also to the environmentalists, talk about where we are in terms of our energy independence.
Now, when the Houthi rebels, they said they have no issue launching more attacks after this. So how much of a threat is that? And are the Houthi our only point of concern right now?
Well, I mean, the biggest concern, I think, to the United States directly is that we do have carriers in the Gulf. We have personnel all over the Middle East, and we want to make sure that they are safe. I think that's the biggest fear the Biden administration has currently, but there are also lots of civilians who are in commercial shipping, and, you know, the United States feels some obligation to protect that kind of commerce. So I think these are the pressures on the Biden administration. I think we're fully equipped militarily to really, you know, deal with any and all of the attacks, but I think they're trying to show fairly massive force early. And when I say massive, I mean joining with the UK and doing it all at once, doing a number of different strikes to limit civilian casualties, but also make sure that those that would attack the United States know that there will be a response every time they do. And that's been, I think, Obama, Trump, and Biden. I don't see a lot of daylight across any of the three presidents in that regard.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. I would imagine, Wendy, if you live in Iowa, you're of a different stock. You're kind of a hardier breed. Is the weather going to matter for the caucuses?
I think the weather doesn't matter as much as maybe those of us on the East Coast or West Coast who are experiencing bad weather might be deterred from getting out the door. I think that the caucuses are locally held, and so I think they are prepared for it. I think the Trump supporters and Trump himself has an advantage in that way because there's generally more enthusiasm consistently among Trump voters in the nomination process so far, particularly in Iowa, than there are the DeSantis or Haley voters. So that's the big challenge for Nikki Haley. Can she draw close enough? She'll probably lose Iowa. I think most of us agree on that. But can she actually draw close enough to say I'm viable going into New Hampshire and really put DeSantis on the sidelines? And if she can do that with some percentage of the vote, maybe more than the 15% or 20%, maybe 25%, something like in that range, I think it makes her more viable as a candidate going into New Hampshire, as I just said. But also the broader primary season becomes more attractive for donors for Nikki Haley if she can slice out a bigger coalition for her in Iowa.
Remind me how the caucuses work. The local precinct, it's not winner take all, right?
No. It's basically people. It's in terms of the precinct. So people actually go to their precinct. It can be a school, it can be a library, it can be somebody's home, and people vote in that area for their choice, right? But you know, the Republicans have proportional representation in their primaries, at least, going till March 15th. So this is an interesting thing people are forgetting. You can pick up delegates throughout this contest until the middle of March. So even though Trump looks like the big front runner, we don't get to winner take all for a couple more months. So that means people like Haley and DeSantis can pick off or collect delegates. And I think that makes a difference, at least in the next couple of weeks.
So if you can, we'll dig into the economics a little bit of this. So like we do, we have the election year, we have the war in Ukraine, we have the war in Gaza. How is this affecting the markets? If you can just dig deeper into the market reaction from all of this put together.
Well, I mean, I think the question is consumer confidence in both government, but also in market predictions, because, you know, there was supposed to be a recession, didn't really turn out that way. We have maybe a soft landing, maybe there'll be a little bit more of a slowdown, but we've seen a very healthy job market just last month. So the question is, who are we going to believe? The same kinds of forces that have infiltrated politics in terms of misinformation, perception, you know, partisanship, the lens of looking at the economy through partisanship, will start to affect people's trusting of economic predictions and the market. At the very high elite levels, not. But for people who are thinking, do I put my money in a savings account in a bank that I know, or do I put it in the stock market? You know, the bank that you know is becoming far more attractive given interest rates than the amorphous stock market. So I think that people who do watch consumer behavior in terms of the stock market have to pay attention to what's happening in politics now in terms of credibility to figure out where people will actually end up putting their money as we go forward this year.
One of his cases, Donald Trump, showed up yesterday, kind of turned it into a political rally of sorts. Is there any degree that you can sense of maybe, as he makes all these appearances in court usually, that there's some Trump fatigue?
I think we're seeing the opposite, and I have been surprised by that trend. But the opposite in terms of his core supporters. There is no bad publicity in Trump's world, in Trump's mind. Every single opportunity to present himself and make his case, he takes. And he takes with vigor and energy. And these are the kinds of things that are frustrating to the Biden campaign. So he will now get the kind of free press, even if we all think maybe it's bad press, but he thinks it's good press, good opportunity, and he'll get the same kind of free press he got in 2016 when everybody covered him. And I think that's what he's looking for. Will there be Trump fatigue 3 or 4 months from now among independents and suburban voters who have not yet committed in their choice for 2024? That's the big question mark. The more we see it here from Donald Trump in what we call the mainstream media, do we get more tired of Donald Trump? He's betting the opposite, at least for the primaries, to shore up his base. Once we get to the summer, I think that's where we really have to take a look at whether people are going to choose Trump and all that Trump brings versus, right now, Biden. And that's where, if we're going to see Trump fatigue, we'll start to see it then.
Okay, what's the gap between undecided versus
primaries that are open?
Still sticking with him on the side, or is he going somewhere else? Still sticking with him on the side, or is he going somewhere else?
Yeah, I've said before that picking somebody like Raphael Warnock, who won in Georgia 4 times technically, and who certainly, in terms of making sure that you stay loyal to your promise to the African American community, to pick an African American candidate, Biden said woman candidate. But nonetheless, that's somebody who can make Georgia competitive. Right now, Georgia won't be competitive, I don't think, in 2024. There's nobody on the ballot that really will generate Democratic turnout. So my proposal has been that if he is faltering generally in ways that are sort of systemic against Trump by the summer, by the convention, there could be a shift in who he selects as his VP.
Wendy, always a pleasure. Appreciate it. Thanks for the update. Wendy Schiller, professor at Brown University. Let's look at the markets right now. S&P 500, 4 points lower. That's down 0.1%. Not a lot of movement today. 47.75 on this Friday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is 188 points lower, and the Nasdaq 100 down 16 points. Some of the real action taking place in the bond market. The 2-year yield 7 basis points lower after that PPI coming in lighter than expectations. Right now at 4.16 on the 2-year. The 10-year yield pretty much unchanged, under 4%, 3.96. You are listening to and watching Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Lisa Mateo. And it brings us to 12:18. Time for an update on company news. And with that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, big cuts are coming at a big bank. Citigroup plans to eliminate 20,000 positions. That move is part of CEO Jane Fraser's strategy to save money and boost returns. Bloomberg's Shonali Basak reports.
We already know there are costs tied to extraneous items in different parts of the world, parts that are largely exiting. This is Jane Fraser's year. This is the year she has to bring the turnaround story to Wall Street. And remember, we have to see what that is in terms of those markets and investment banking businesses.
That's Bloomberg's Shonali Basak reporting. Shares of Citigroup are currently down less than 1.25%. Mishaps with Boeing and Japan Airlines are drawing fresh scrutiny from the airline industry and safety procedures. Bloomberg's Amy Morris reports from Washington.
Current regulations require airlines to be able to evacuate an entire plane of passengers in just 90 seconds in an emergency. But skeptics argue enforcement is lax because simulations don't account for disabled passengers, children, or obstacles. Senators have already called for oversight and a hearing on the Boeing 737 MAX 9 door plug failure. In the meantime, lawmakers want Congress to act on a 5-year bill reauthorizing the FAA before that expires on March 8th. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
The brewer of Budweiser is going for gold. Anheuser-Busch InBev is tapped as a sponsor of the Olympic Games. The company's non-alcoholic Corona Cero will be the global sponsor for Olympic events through 2028. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red on the final trading session of the week ahead of a long holiday weekend. We've got the S&P now lower by 1 point, little changed at 47.78. The Dow down 164, drop there of 0.4%. NASDAQ lower by 10, a decline of 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 index little changed as well, down 6 points right now, with the Russell 2000 down 5, a decline there of 0.3%. 10-year yield 3.95%. We've got spot gold now at $2,043 the ounce, up $14, up 0.7%. Cannot ignore the move in Bitcoin today to the downside, tumbling 6.1%. Bitcoin now at 43,318. Crude oil, West Texas Intermediate, up 0.8%, 72.63 a barrel. BlackRock has agreed to buy Adebayo Ogunlesi's Global Infrastructure Partners for about $12.5 billion, vaulting the world's biggest money manager into the top ranks of investors that make long-term bets on energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink spoke about the deal this morning with Bloomberg Radio.
I think we have the business strategy down. I'm confident we are in the early part of this infrastructure revolution, and we wanted to have the scale. We wanted to have the expertise, the operational expertise of GIP, marrying that expertise with BlackRock's global relationships with companies and governments, marrying our existing expertise in decarbonization and infrastructure. It's a perfect partnership.
And on a down day for U.S. markets, we are seeing BlackRock shares advance. BlackRock right now up by about 0.1%. So again, recapping, down day for U.S. markets. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ in the red. S&P down 2, drop there of less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pella, thanks for the update. We appreciate it. I'm John Tucker along with Lisa Mateo. We are in for Matt and Paul. And let's take a deeper dive into these markets today. What stands out to me right now, Lisa, is the two-year Treasury, which is more policy reactive. That's 7 basis points lower, 4.16. That would be just around the lowest since May. An unexpected decline in producer prices, reinforcing bets the Federal Reserve cuts rates this year. Of course, it comes after the hotter than expected CPI figures we got yesterday. Let's get the macro view now. Phil Orlando, Chief Equity Strategist with Federated Hermes, joins us. Phil, good to talk to you. Take your pick. What narrative have you latched onto?
There are many from which to choose. I'm less inclined to look at the PPI, the wholesale inflation this morning. Yesterday, CPI, critically important, and then the personal consumption expenditure index coming up later in the month. So looking at yesterday's CPI, that number was just much hotter than expected. November year-on-year nominal was up 3.1%. December, 3.4%. And that was a couple of ticks higher than expected. So what you look at what the Federal Reserve has been doing, you've got some investors out there. Frankly, I think the consensus is expecting the Fed to cut rates 6 times over the course of this year, with that first cut coming in the month of March. We just don't see that. Given how hot inflation still is, we think the Fed is going to be patient, vigilant, try to make sure that inflation is heading down to their 2% core PCE target. So we're looking at a couple of rate cuts in the back half of the year, not 6 that are starting in the month of March.
Now, what about recession thoughts? Are they on the back burner?
We are officially in the soft landing camp. That said, we still expect the economy to slow materially over the course of the next year or so. So you look at this fourth quarter that's going to get flashed in about 2 weeks. We're at 1.5% GDP growth. That compares to the third quarter at 4.9%. That's a pretty significant decline. And then as you look at, say, the first 3 quarters of this year, we're going to be limping along, we think, at about a 1% run rate. So the Federal Reserve, in our view, has done exactly what it intended to do. Over the last 2 years, they took the funds rate from 0 to 5.5%. They cut their balance sheet from $9 trillion to, $7.7 trillion. They were hoping to see the economy slow, the rate of unemployment increase a little bit, inflation come down materially, and all of that's playing out. At this point, I think they just want to be, very careful, very cautious, very patient to make sure that inflation is sustainably moving down to their target. I think they'll come to that conclusion by the time we get to, say, the July FOMC meeting.
I don't want to get too wonky, but I'm still having a little trouble wrapping my thoughts around the shelter component and how that specifically is measured and whether it really is accurate at this point.
Well, we can discuss or debate whether or not it's accurate or not, but here's the big picture. That inflation peaked last year and is coming down. No question. Full stop. But you look at the housing market, and in calendar 21 and calendar 22, housing prices in the United States went up by 50%, 50%. So while it's absolutely true that inflation is generally coming down and that housing prices have sort of peaked here, we're not seeing a 50% decline in housing prices. And the investment that we make as individuals in our homes, for a lot of us, is the most significant investment that we have in our personal portfolios. I think that's weighing on consumer attitude and consumer mentality, and then that translates back into the rental component of the CPI calculation, which accounts for about 40% of that number. So it will come down and wash itself out over time, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And to some degree, that's creating some of the noise and some of the stickiness in the data.
So with all that said, Phil, CPI, PPI, how are you changing your strategy moving into 2024?
So we sort of made that change back in late October. When the S&P 500 got to that 4,100 level, we felt that that was dramatically oversold, and we felt that we could get to the 4,800 level by the end of this year, the 5,200 level by the end of calendar 24. And we felt that the rally last year was disproportionately driven by the Mag 7, and we felt that there was going to be reversion to the mean there. So what we wanted to do, and we're maintaining that strategy now, is look at the sectors of the market that had been left for dead that we felt would finally find some love. So domestic small cap growth, domestic large cap value, and international are the areas that we think are going to be the winners in the fourth quarter of last year and over the course of calendar 24.
All right, your view overall of technology in the new year, and then since we got their earnings today, the financials.
So, growth stocks, technology stocks are still great companies. I'm not going to tell you that Google or Softy or NVIDIA are bad companies. They're not. The question is that valuations may have gotten a little bit ahead of themselves in terms of all of the AI FOMO that we experienced over the course of last year. So at this point, we are slightly underweight growth in technology, but we're not zero. We're maintaining a slight underweight position. Financials are one of the areas that we really like, along with energy and healthcare. Those were areas you look at financials, for example. This time last year, first quarter of last year, those stocks were absolutely obliterated based upon the problems with the commercial real estate market. A lot of those stocks were down 50%. They sort of double bottomed in the fall and then have started to come back up. So there's a lot of catch up that has to happen there. And you look at some of the quality numbers, for example, that came out of JP Morgan this morning. We think financials are a sector that's probably going to do pretty well over the course of this year as they sort of get back on trend in terms of valuation.
Phil, disinflation, good for markets or not good for markets?
I think everyone would be happy to see the Fed hit their core PCE number at 2%. But here's sort of the interesting thing. We're rapidly approaching that number. And by our count, we could be there by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. But you look at the Fed's latest SEP, the Summary of Economic Projections that they published just in the middle of December. They're telling us that they're not confident that we're going to get to that 2% level until the end of calendar 2026. That's 3 years from now. So where's the disconnect here? Is the Fed being too conservative, or do they know something that we don't know? That this last mile, so to speak, on getting to that 2% target is going to be like hand-to-hand combat. And they're taking a very prudent, very patient approach just to make sure that things are moving in the right direction.
All right, unfair question time. Year-end S&P 500 target.
Not unfair. 5,200 is our number.
Okay. We're right now at 47.76. Also, still waiting for that.
We think we're going to be up 8 or 9% over the course of this year, which is a very modest year compared to the 24% gain we saw last year.
Phil, always a pleasure. Appreciate it. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Phil Orlando, Chief Equity Strategist with Federated Hermes. And as we look at the markets right now, S&P 500, 4 points lower, at least 47.75. Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 198 points to wrap up the week, down about 0.5%. The Nasdaq 100, 13 points lower. That's down just a little less than 0.1% right now. Again, I'll go back to the yields. The 2-year after the PPI this morning, 8 basis points lower. The yield down to 4.16. The 10-year, 1 basis point lower. That is down below 4% at 3.95. This is Bloomberg. And it's now 12:33 on Wall Street. It's time for a look at world and national news. Let's head to Washington right now. And Nancy Lyons of Bloomberg News. Hi, Nance.
Thanks, John. Yemen's Houthi rebels are vowing to retaliate for American and British airstrikes against them. The U.S. and the U.K. took aim at more than 60 Houthi targets in 16 locations overnight across Yemen. The bombing was in response to the Houthis' campaign of drone and missile attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. Norman Rule, a former intelligence officer now with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says it's unclear if the situation will now escalate.
We hope it's a one-off, but that's really up to the Houthis. I think what we have to look at is whether a Houthi counter strike will be symbolic, meant to show defiance, or really something that indicates that they haven't got the message. If the latter is the case, there will certainly be a broader strike by the United States, probably the United Kingdom. But again, it'll be carefully calibrated to move up the escalatory ladder.
Norman Rule spoke with Bloomberg Surveillance. The Biden administration is rolling out another pathway to debt relief for certain student loan borrowers. The program targets people who took out less than $12,000 as their initial student loan balance and have been paying it down for 10 years. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona outlined the details on ABC's Start Here podcast.
For those who have borrowed either $12,000 or less, after 10 years, they would be receiving loan forgiveness. But we were going to roll that out in July of this year, and eager to do that. But instead, we're going to be rolling it out today.
Cardona says the Education Department will start automatically discharging debts next month for people who qualify and are already enrolled in SAVE, which is an income-driven repayment plan that was rolled out last year. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks lower, a little changed with the S&P 500 index right now down 4 points, down less than 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 184. That is a drop now of just about 0.5%. NASDAQ, the composite index, down 19, decline there of 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 down 15, a drop there of 0.1%. 10-year yield 3.95%. The 2-year 4.16%. Gold up 0.7%, 20.42 the ounce. Crude oil very much in focus. West Texas Intermediate crude higher, up 0.7%, 72.51 a barrel on WTI. Cannot ignore Bitcoin today. Big move to the downside, now lower by 5.7%. Bitcoin at 43,549. Treasury 2-year yields hitting the lowest since May as an unexpected decline in producer prices reinforces bets on Fed rate cuts this year. Right now, the 2-year 4.16. But what about the U.S. economy skirting a recession? That question moments ago for Phil Orlando, Chief Equity Market Strategist at Federated Hermes, who was interviewed right here on Bloomberg Markets.
We are officially in the soft landing camp. That said, we still expect the economy to slow materially over the course of the next year or so. So you look at this fourth quarter that's going to get flashed in about 2 weeks. We're at 1.5% GDP growth. That compares to the third quarter at 4.9%. That's a pretty significant decline.
And by the way, Phil Orlando told us he has got a 5,200 year-end target on the S&P 500 index. To put that in context, 47.73 right now on the S&P. Bank stocks lower after earnings across the board. JP Morgan Chase down 0.6%. Citigroup down by about 1%. Wells Fargo down now by 3%. Bank of America after earnings down 1.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thanks very much. You're listening to Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Lisa Mateo. We're in for Matt and Paul. Let's move on to our next story. It has to do with oil, the energy complex. Oil tanker owners, they stopped sending their ships through the southern Red Sea today. This comes after the U.S. and U.K. airstrikes in Yemen. This is the clearest example yet of disruption to petroleum flows since Houthi militants began attacking commercial vessels there. And right now, as we look at oil, Brent crude, the international benchmark, 68 cents higher, 78.09. Let's take a deeper dive now with our next guest. Ben Cook is manager of the Hennessy Energy Transition Fund, discussing the outlook for energy investing this year amid the geopolitical uncertainty. I got to tell you, Ben, I would have thought that the price of crude, especially the international benchmark, would be higher. Right now, it's still under 80. Well, what's your view?
Yeah, good afternoon, John. Thanks for having me. Look, I think given the geopolitical flashpoints we see around the world, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, what we're seeing in the Red Sea, obviously, there is a bit of a geopolitical risk premium now in the price of crude. I think the important thing to recognize here today is that even though those headlines would imply a disruption to trade routes, we haven't seen a tangible loss in output, and without any significant magnitude of crude oil coming off the market. The price obviously will respond positively to headlines, but again, without the loss of supply or disruption, it's hard for crude to maintain those elevated levels.
So with all that said, are energy equities still attractive?
Lisa, yeah, we think they are. 2024 stands to be a pretty good year for energy, in our opinion. We think the global economy will grow. Our view is in line with consensus. Global GDP should rise on the order of 2.5%. And that would imply an increase in the appetite for crude oil. We think demand should grow on the order of 1.5% to 2% this year. And importantly, on the supply side, we think that non-OPEC sources will moderate. Growth out of the U.S. will moderate. And as a result, that'll provide some cover to OPEC to bring some volumes back to market. And that's important because as they do, that will diminish the spare capacity that's available on the market. It should provide some buoyancy to global crude oil prices. We anticipate by the back half of the year, we'll see WTI back above the $80 per barrel range, and that should set up nicely for energy investors in energy equities.
Are we going to see more consolidation in the industry, particularly when it comes to the shale play?
Yeah, John, I think we will. To date, we've seen a number of significant deals: Exxon, Pioneer, Chevron, Hess, more recently Chesapeake, Southwestern. What we're seeing is a consolidation of acreage in some of these premier shale plays in the U.S. lower 48. And as the industry continues to pursue productivity gains that come with increased scale, obviously cost efficiencies that are an additional benefit, the elimination of redundancies across management teams, I think there will be good financial incentive to continue to pursue M&A in the shale patch here in the U.S.
How many shale fields are left?
The major shale plays make up probably 5 to 6 key basins. The Appalachian Basin for natural gas, of course, the Permian Basin in West Texas and eastern New Mexico, Eagle Ford Shale, DJ Basin, Bakken. Those represent the biggest shale plays. And importantly, in those plays, there's still a significant number of public and private operators that could become viable targets for consolidation.
But not sure if this is in your wheelhouse, but where does the FTC stand, on these deals, but oil and gas deals?
Yeah, what we've seen, the regulatory authorities actually move to request additional information on both the Exxon Pioneer deals and the Chevron Hess deals. I think that's going to continue to be an issue. The reality is that once they dig deeper, they'll realize the concentration in market share power is de minimis compared to the overall market for these commodities. And so we wouldn't expect, a significant impediment to these transactions getting consummated.
At the end of the day, I don't put crude oil in my car. I put in a refined product. And what's the outlook there? Because we're still under, in my neck of the woods, $3 a gallon. And that's got me smiling, Ben. What are the factors that go into that, even as we see crude oil prices rise?
Yeah, great question. Refined products, obviously, they're a global market, and just as they are for crude, and the supplies of those refined products, the inventories, and the demand and supply for on a real-time basis for refined products such as gasoline and diesel, jet, et cetera, that's going to have an impact on pricing. We've seen a decline over the last several months in refined product pricing, and as that's been a function of rising inventories. We've seen gasoline inventories migrate back toward historical seasonal averages, and so that's why we've seen the price of gasoline come down. On the heating oil distillate side, we've seen inventories remain at depressed levels, and that's true on a global basis. Heating oil and diesel prices should remain elevated as the refining industry works to replenish inventories of those categories of refined products. But again, going back to our view on global demand, if we anticipate the rate of growth globally in terms of GDP, we would anticipate an increased appetite for refined product consumption as well, and that should push pricing a bit higher as we move towards the balance of the back half of the year.
Hey, quick 30 seconds, Ben. Who are you liking right now in the energy space?
Yeah, we do have a preference for traditional hydrocarbons in that category. We like companies that have attractive asset bases with low cost structures that tends to afford a resiliency in volatile commodity markets. Companies that possess balance sheets that are improving, and of course management teams that are strong. The companies that combine most of those favorable elements would include ExxonMobil. They've generated decent results in the upstream with exploration success in Guyana, and they're certainly buying back a significant number of shares. ConocoPhillips also falls into that category, another upstream company, as well as Cheniere Energy, which is a major exporter of LNG here from the United States.
Ben, thanks for stopping by today. Appreciate it. Ben Cook, manager of the Hennessy Energy Transition Fund. His outlook for energy investing in 2024. As we look at Brent crude, up 84 cents, up about 1%, 78.25 a barrel. NYMEX crude up 9/10 at 72.69. This is Bloomberg. And that brings us to 12:50 on Wall Street. Let's get an update on company news. And with that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, you were talking about the price of oil being up. So are shares of ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron after the U.S. and U.K. launched strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen. More on that from Bloomberg's Bill Ferries.
People have been greatly worried that the Israel-Hamas war would expand into a regional conflict. There will be people who look at this and say it's more sign that this is closer to dragging Iran into it. Iran has been a big supporter of the Houthis. It remains to be seen whether they can resupply those Houthi rebels at all, given the military firepower still amassed in the Red Sea. But it certainly brings it one step closer to this becoming a much broader conflict.
Bloomberg's Bill Ferries reporting. Citigroup is cutting 20,000 jobs as part of CEO Jane Fraser's strategy to boost returns. The latest from Bloomberg's Shonali Basak.
Jane Fraser, we know, inherited a bank that was bloated, that had regulatory issues, and that had many layers of bureaucracy that she is now taking an absolute axe to. Investors have largely rewarded her moves to do that, though it'll take a minute to get through all those layers of management. Now, that is the fixing story, but where does she get competitive in those Wall Street businesses? And also, I'm looking at cost of credit as well.
That's Bloomberg's Shonali Basak reporting. Faster than the speed of sound, NASA and Lockheed Martin this afternoon will unveil a supersonic jet that can top 900 miles per hour. The inaugural flight of the research aircraft is expected this year. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg.
Hey, you're listening to Bloomberg Markets.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in for Paul Sweeney. As we wrap up the trading week, right now the major averages, they are unchanged to lower at this point. S&P 500 up just barely, 47.80, 47.96. That was the number to watch. That was the record that we set. The record closed 2 years ago. Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 152 points. Let's right now get an update on news from around the world. And for that, let's head to Washington. And that's where we find Bloomberg's... Oh, I'm sorry. We're not going to go to Washington for world and national news. Instead, let's say hi to Bloomberg News Markets reporter Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, as we wrap up the week, not a lot of movement. One of the things that stands out to me, though, is the more policy-reactive two-year yield. That is down 8 basis points, 416. And to me, it is a reaction to the lighter-than-expected PPI report we got in contrast to yesterday's hotter-than-expected CPI. But it also highlights kind of the disconnect, I think, between the bond market participants and what we're hearing from various Fed officials.
It certainly does. And earlier there was a red hat head out saying investors are now pricing in 160 bips of cuts, so a little more than the 6 that had been priced in. The Fed is at 3. It's interesting that you're talking about that PPI and the bond market reaction to it yesterday. I'm pretty certain, I'm just going to pull it up right now just to make sure that I'm correct in terms of what I'm saying. We had a rally for bonds as well. In fact, we've had a rally for bonds over the last 6 days for that 2-year yield over the last week, coming in more than 20 basis points. And yesterday, John, there was something about it that almost felt like it was haven-driven as opposed to Fed-driven, because we did have the hotter-than-expected CPI, so you would have thought that investors would send yields the other direction. And then with the Bitcoin ETFs they launched initially were higher, and then there was a reversal, so some of the risk-off, risk-on mood. And now today we have this rally for bonds again, because we really have to think about it that way sometimes. Traditionally, when yields come in, that tells you that investors are looking for safety. They're looking for haven bonds. Over the last year or two, we've come to think of it so much around the Fed. But for some reason, more recently, I really do think that there's a little bit of a haven bid in there. But it is a notable move, that 2-year yield, as you mentioned, down 8 basis points. What's interesting is we also have stocks down, because when yields are down like this, typically you would have in the recent dichotomy, you would have stocks higher because it would mean liquidity is staying in the system. But this is a true risk-off day. We have stocks down, albeit not by a lot for the S&P 500, but the Russell 2000, the bank index down more than 1%, with bonds rallying as well.
And backing up, I suppose, your idea of haven bid, also the dollar higher, dollar DXY up about 0.2% right now. Let's move on to the bank earnings. Big day for the financial. Net interest income, that's the closely watched number on Wall Street, how much money is being made on lending. You have JP Morgan Chase, $90 billion for 2023. That's about $30 billion more than the closest competitor, Bank of America. As far as banks go, it's almost like JP Morgan Chase and everybody else.
Agreed. JP Morgan Chase is clearly the best in breed, and it shows in the stock performance too over the last year. JP Morgan Chase now up about 25%. I believe Bank of America is down a little bit over the last year. Citigroup up a little bit on hopes that their turnaround plan is going to work. The other thing notable about that net interest income that you're talking about for JP Morgan, it was a record. And excuse me, in terms of their earnings, adjusted earnings beat by 22%. Revenues, it was a small miss. You know, you're just throwing around $90 billion as though it's 90 cents or 90 shells or 90 something. But, you know, it's interesting. Citigroup missed revenues. They missed revenues by more than $1 billion. I mean, that's such a massive miss. It's really kind of amazing. The last time I looked, that stock was up. I'm pulling it up right now. So it's up about 0.4%. It's off the highs. But it tells you there's so much hope around this turnaround plan by Jane Fraser.
All right, Bloomberg News Markets reporter Abigail Doolittle. Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. S&P 500 right now 2 points lower. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 168 points. The Nasdaq Composite Index, that is down 11 points. Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew. That starts right now.
Now, from from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Just 1 week to the shutdown. Is it a deal or no deal? That's the question. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As Speaker Mike Johnson tells reporters today, he plans to stand by the spending deal that he made with Chuck Schumer despite great pushback and, frankly, outrage by some on his right flank. We're going to talk about next steps and chances of a possible shutdown coming up with Republican Congressman Buddy Carter of Georgia. We go to the source here on Sound On. The U.S. and U.K. strike back at Houthi rebels in Yemen. We'll have a report for you straight from the Pentagon this hour. And Iowa is only 3 days off. We'll have analysis on the race from our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us for the hour. And we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet helps us with that from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. Stocks are lower, but the S&P now little change. Down 0.5 point, Joe, on this Friday. We are on track for a winning week for the S&P 500 index. But right now, down just 0.5 point on the S&P. Dow Industrials down 153, a decline there of 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 6, down less than 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 Index, full of those big tech names, also little change, down by 1 point right now. Russell 2000 down 0.3%. 10-year 3.97% with a 2-year 4.16%. Gold up $15 the ounce to $2,044, up by about 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%, $72.59 a barrel. While Treasury 2-year yields have hit the lowest since May as an unexpected decline in producer prices reinforce bets on Federal Reserve rate cuts this year. As for the rate cut outlook, Tony Dwyer is Chief Market Strategist at Canaccord Genuity.
I've long said that over the last 6 months that inflation is not the problem. Inflation, the trajectory is coming down pretty sharply. The issue is going to be ultimately what lower margins and lower input costs are going to mean, which is corporate earnings could have a little bit of risk near term. So I'm in the camp that the Fed is going to have to cut rates more than the market thinks.
And again, we've got the 10-year 3.97%. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. Delta Airlines backing away from its 2024 profit target. That's because persistently high costs are countering gains from a rebound in international travel. And among some of the airline names today, we are looking at shares of Delta Airlines. Right now, Delta is lower by 8.6%. Tough day for this group, but United down by 10%, American down 8.8%, Southwest now lower by 4.7%. Developing story, getting word today that Boeing is being sued by passengers on an Alaska Airlines flight that was forced to make an emergency landing in Portland, Oregon last week after a midair blowout of a so-called door plug on the 737 MAX 9 jet. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Happy Friday. Welcome to the threshold of the weekend. Bloomberg Sound On the radio, satellite, and YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we're counting down here, right? 3 days to Iowa, 1 week to a partial government shutdown. We'll get back to Iowa in a minute because we have news from Capitol Hill as the Speaker of the House says he is standing by the deal. Maybe we will not be shutting down next week, although how we get it all done in time is another matter. The Speaker did talk to reporters earlier, remembering the re-agreement, as we called it, between the Speaker and Chuck Schumer on top-line spending levels. Without them, we're nowhere. Here he is from a short time ago.
Our top-line agreement remains. We are getting our next steps together, and we are working toward a robust appropriations process.
All right, simple as that. Nothing to see here. Move right along. The issue, of course, is the few number of legislative days left to make this happen. And it begs the question, as we're hearing from the Senate, what about a CR? Will there be a short-term funding solution here? Because obviously, folks, as we've been hearing very loudly on the Freedom Caucus, to the speaker's right flank, if I can even put it that way, are not in favor of a CR. Bob Good, the chair of the Freedom Caucus, saying, don't fear the shutdown. And we've heard that from him before. The question is how it all might come together. Remembering the laddered CR, right? This next Friday is the first tranche, the first 4 spending bills. February 2nd, the rest of the government would shut down. And that's the big stuff like defense, which is why a lot of people are looking at that as the real date. And this is where we start our conversation with Congressman Buddy Carter, the Republican from Georgia, is with us on this Friday, and it's good to see you, Congressman. Welcome back to Bloomberg. What do you think is going to happen here? Can we get this done in time, or does a CR seem inevitable?
At this point, it does seem like a CR is inevitable. I don't see how we could get it done. Not the way the Senate operates, not the amount of time it's going to take for them to get it through their body. I just don't see that happening. And I suspect, even though the speaker has said that he does not want any more short-term CRs, I don't see any way around it short of a partial shutdown.
The idea of a CR for the rest of the fiscal year has even been floated, Congressman. Is that the world we're in, or would a little more time actually help write these 12 spending bills?
Well, I think a little more time would help. We've been out for 3 weeks with Christmas and everything, and then, but the time, a little bit of time would help. I do think we're closer than what it may appear. We got the top line number now. I know that there are some in our conference who are not happy with that top line number, but I don't know that they're not happy about the top line number as much as they are about the side deals. The side deals is what really bothers me that much, and that takes that 1.59 up to almost 1.8. I mean, it's. The side deals are what really bothers me. Now, having said that, I will tell you that I think that the speaker was successful in getting some good, immediate cuts in the budget, real money cuts, $10 billion in IRS, $6 billion in the COVID slush fund, clawing that back, $16 billion. And that's nothing to laugh at. That's real money. So that was good. And we also got some of the budget gimmicks that are just ridiculous, that we got rid of some of those. So there was some gain in this. And I think the speaker did the best he could do at this time with a slim majority and only one leg of the three-legged stool.
Yeah. You consider yourself an ally of the speaker, right? Because he's hearing some pretty tough talk from the Freedom Caucus. We're hearing motion to vacate again, or at least on the table. The idea that if he does what Kevin McCarthy did, he could be fired. Where do you fall on this, Representative?
Well, first of all, I thought Kevin McCarthy got a raw deal, and I was a big supporter of Kevin, and I just think that was absolutely wrong. I am a supporter of Mike Johnson's. I want him to be successful. I want him to help. I want to help him be successful, and I want to help us be successful. Look, no one wants to cut spending as much as I do. It is out of control. Let me tell you, right now, the federal government is taking in, through revenue and everything else, and land deals, whatever it may be, $6.4 trillion. That's $6.4 trillion that we are spending every year. That's $204,000 per second. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. We are spending money faster than the speed of light. That is unsustainable. We've got to stop that. We've got to stop this outrageous spending. I get it. And let's also keep in mind that those on the right, a lot of what they are concerned about is the southern border. And we need to get that southern border as part of this. This is our leverage to get real reforms done at the southern border.
Well, I'd like to hear from you on that a little bit more, because we've spent weeks, a couple months here, talking about a potential deal on the border that would be tied to the supplemental funding request for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. But we have been hearing from more Republican House members that they want to see border in this spending bill. And I think Chip Roy, in fact, is the one who's saying either close the border or close the government. Do you feel that way?
Right. Well, I'd rather see us secure the border and shut down the border than I would see us shut down the government. And government shutdowns are just not good. I've been through a number of them, and you just made the comment a minute ago that it's how do you get into one? Well, it's not so much how you get into one; it's how you get out of one. It's difficult to get out of a shutdown, inexpensive. But at the same time, a government shutdown is not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen would be for us not to get anything out of that southern border, not to get any kind of policy reforms, any kind of in making sure we're enforcing the laws that are on the books right now. That's one of the things that needs to be done. That's why Mayor Orcus needs to go. He needs to be impeached, and because he's not enforcing the laws that are on the book right now. But we need that. We need that at the southern border. We also need to stop this outrageous spending.
A lot of folks have suggested that the timing of a Mayorkas impeachment could kneecap this whole idea of crafting a deal on the border. It's a sentiment that even Senator Jim Lankford has expressed, the chief Republican at the table. You're on the border, on the budget committee, Congressman. How much time do you actually need? If these top line spending levels are in place, can you get it done in the next 2-3 weeks?
We could. I'm very optimistic. And again, a lot of that depends on the Senate. The rules in the Senate are different, and it takes them time to get things like this done. So, but on the House side, we could get it done rather quickly, yes. But then again, keep in mind, it's got to go through the Senate. Not only that, but these are this is a lot of work for staff to do. Staff's going to need a couple of 3 days to get all these numbers put together. So it's not like, oh, it passed the Senate, it passed the House, then it goes to the president's desk. Well, there's going to be a little interlude there as well.
Spending time with Congressman Buddy Carter, the Republican from Georgia, not only on the budget committee, but a member of the House that is in some cases outraged by President Biden deciding to approve of airstrikes, authorize airstrikes that were conducted last night against Houthi rebels in Yemen. Congressman, we've heard from a couple of different quarters of the House. It's not every day Ro Khanna and Mike Lee are agreeing on things. Mike Lee says the Constitution matters regardless of party affiliation. Pramila Jayapal, who runs the Progressive Caucus in the House, calling him out for a, quote, unacceptable violation of the Constitution. What's your thought on that decision by the commander-in-chief? Was it the right thing to do?
I think it was the right thing to do, yes. And I think it's about time he did it. I mean, let's face it. The Houthis have been using our troops, our Navy, as target practice, and we can't allow that to happen. We've got to be strong. We've got to fight back and have backbone. There's no question about that in my mind. Now, as far as the constitutionality of it, I'll leave that for others to decide. But for us just to let our troops sit out there, let our Navy sit out there and be target practice for these terrorists is unacceptable. We've got to fight back.
I appreciate your time today, Congressman. Thanks for joining us from what looks like a warmer place than Iowa right now. The gentleman from Georgia, we thank you. Republican Buddy Carter. On Bloomberg, as we assemble our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano have been listening along here and want their take on this, I guess we can call it news, the fact that the speaker is not backing out of a top-line spending deal. Maybe we won't shut down. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. What do you think here, Rick? It's on again, off again with this speaker, and he's got a right flank that's apparently pretty angry with him. Does he have enough Buddy Carters to get something done here?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think he's not going to get a majority of the Republican vote because it only takes a couple of guys in the Freedom Caucus to hold things up if it were just a Republican vote. But the reality is this is going to be voted on by the entire House of Representatives, and there are plenty of Democratic votes to try and not close down government. So he's got the wind at his back when it comes to actually taking a vote. He's going to obviously have to violate the one rule that McCarthy tried to stick to and ultimately paid the price of his speakership by violating it, which is, having more than just Republican votes to pass something. And kudos to him for agreeing to something that frankly has already been agreed to, for the last 3 months. So, let's get on with the passage of these appropriations bills and let government function in a proper fashion.
So how you feeling then, Jeannie? Is it less likely that we shut down? It's so difficult to pick through the minutia every day and have a sense of direction or momentum on these talks. We're celebrating the fact that the speaker is not bailing on a deal that's already been made twice. Does that keep the government open?
You know, I think it is in everybody's interest, obviously, to keep the government open. I agree with Rick. There's probably enough Democratic votes, certainly enough Democratic votes to keep it open. But I think we should take a step back and acknowledge this is by no means the way our government should be working. This is not regular order. I mean, what we're looking at here, to your question to the representative, is either another short term in a long line of CRs or a longer term. We've had very little information from the speaker. The absence of leadership, the confusing messaging is all over the place. So yes, we all hope, I hope, that he's able to stick with the deal he made with Chuck Schumer and keep this thing open for a little while longer. But at what point are we going to have a government that functions in the way it should out of Congress? The reality is there is no way that we should be living off of short-term CRs. And I'm not sure how long the new speaker can keep this up. You know, I again hope it stays open and we get this CR. But this is not regular order. This is not good process. And it is shameful to watch the messaging that's gone on.
Well, I can't imagine that this is real, Rick Davis, but apparently the speaker did float the idea, at least behind closed doors, of a year-long CR, something I mentioned to Congressman Buddy Carter there. Republicans on the Armed Services Committee freaked out when they heard about this because that would amount to a defense spending cut. There's no real world where that happens, is there?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a rookie speaker, right? And, you know, I don't know if he actually understands all the ramifications of the things that he kicks out every day. People on the Armed Services Committee of both the House and the Senate, the HASC and the SASC, would flip out if they thought that Republicans were going to be party to a significant cut in defense spending in the middle of the crises that we have going on all around the world. I think that's a complete non-starter, but we can't anticipate what someone with no experience like Speaker Johnson has. We can't anticipate what kind of ideas he's going to float that ultimately will get shot down.
Mm-hmm. Chair Mike Rogers, the Armed Services Committee, Jeannie, says, not a viable option, no path forward, don't try it. Is that how this ends?
I think so. And you know, if we can just look at some of the cuts that Representative Carter was talking to you about, the $10 billion in IRS, he's right. We're spending more than the speed of light per minute. But how on God's green earth is cutting the IRS going to help? We are hurting ourselves. That's how we get money, is by holding people to account to pay the IRS, to cut that $10 billion. This is the folly that we're dealing with on the Republican side. They're talking about these cuts as if they're real. We will all lose money as a result. So, you know, to your question, I hope it ends there. But, you know, at this point, we have a speaker who seems to be all over the map on messaging. He's going to have to get a CR. I
can't imagine the conversation that we're going to be having 1 week from today. Rick and Jeannie will be with us. This is...
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks now trading mixed with the S&P 500 index higher. Little changed, up by 1 point. Has been swinging between gains and losses. Dow Industrials down 137 now, dropped there of 0.4%. And we've got NASDAQ trading lower by 1 point. Little change. That perhaps the key takeaway right now. 10-year yield 3.96%. Treasury 2-year yields hitting the lowest since May right now. The 2-year 4.16%. Spot gold up 0.9%, 2,047 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude on the move up 1.3%, 72.92 a barrel. And Brent 78.51, a gain there of 1.4%. Bitcoin now plunging 5.5%. Bitcoin at 43,638 on Bitcoin. TKO Group Holdings winning record of buy ratings from every analyst on Wall Street has been broken. Now, TKO is the parent of World Wrestling Entertainment, an Ultimate Fighting Championship. TD Cowen, unimpressed with the sports entertainment company's performance and legal troubles, kicked off with a market perform recommendation, the first non-buy equivalent rating given to the company since it started trading in September. TKO down 2.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're learning more by the hour here on what happened last night, the airstrike staged by the U.S. and the U.K. against Houthi rebels in Yemen. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We thank you for joining us on the Friday edition of Sound On. These headlines broke late yesterday, and we're just getting real details now on what happened with dozens of strikes here. And, of course, we turn to our friend Tony Capaccio, reporting from the Pentagon here at Bloomberg, and he's with us in studio now to set things up, and we'll have some analysis on all of this from our panel, knowing there are real political ramifications here. We just talked to Congressman Buddy Carter. He actually supports, as a Republican, what the president did last night. Progressives on the left do not. And some are even calling it, in the case of Ro Khanna, a violation of Article 1, which is something that we'll get to. But, Tony, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here.
And thank you for the invite.
The extent of these strikes apparently larger than we might have even thought at first. How would you kind of put this in context?
Yeah, this eked out last night. The U.S. Central Command and the Pentagon really wouldn't talk about the extent of the strikes, but it was the U.S. Air Force's Central Command that put out a release late last night. They put this in context. They said there were over 60 targets at 16 locations and over 100 precision munitions. That's a lot. Against Syria, against Libya in 2011, the U.S. launched like 112 Tomahawks. Well, I just found out a little while ago that of the over 100, about 80, more than 80 were U.S. Navy Tomahawk missiles. They were fired from the USS Philippines, a cruiser, the Gravely, and the Mason, 2 destroyers, plus the USS Florida, a submarine that carries Tomahawks. So this is a largely Navy action, and I think they're chopping at the bit to talk a little bit more about their contribution. But it was a large operation.
It sounds like it, and the extent that it was not just the U.S., this was, in fact, an international operation here. The U.K. did most of the heavy lifting beyond the U.S., from what we understand, right?
The armaments part of it, yeah.
Yeah. So what does that tell you in terms of the decisions that they made on the types of weapons that were used to stay as far away as possible?
Not only stay as far away as possible, but the Tomahawks that were used, if it's the model, I think it is the most recent model, these things can loiter around and retarget. Wow. They just don't go... They just go fly and go pop. Yeah. They can fly around and retarget. So they hit storage and launch facilities for missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. That tells me that the targets, they wanted it to be double sure there were no civilians around and to be very precise that their maps going in matched what they were seeing on the ground. But it's an interesting $1 million missile that the U.S. used last night.
And we fired 80 of them?
Over 80 of the 100, which was a surprise to me.
So we dropped over $80 million just on cruise missiles.
Always at Bloomberg, you think of the money.
Well, I mean, that's quite a price tag. And at some point, we need new ones, which is a whole other story.
Right.
I realize this was orchestrated by a Secretary of Defense in a hospital bed.
I think it was approved by.
Okay.
This was an interesting chronology I'm starting to pick up on. So this massive Russian-like Houthi attack was on Tuesday, the 9th.
Yes.
Well, I think that's what precipitated the strikes. But the next day, the Pentagon put out a statement saying that among the activities of the secretary, he was briefed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Brown, and then General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander. So looking back, it tipped me off that CENTCOM was tasked really quick to come up with a plan, and then brief it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then brief it to Austin, and from there it goes to the National Security Council.
Fascinating. We don't have any update on his condition or any sense of when he's getting out, do we?
We don't have any sense of that, but apparently he's comfortable and thankfully recovering.
Yeah. The Houthis promised before we struck a big response. We don't know anything about that. I presume did we render their military, if we can even call it that, or are they useless now after these strikes?
I don't think useless because they may have underground facilities that the U.S. wasn't able to strike. But I guarantee you right now that the skies over Yemen or looking into Yemen now on P-8 maritime surveillance and drones, they're looking there to see if there's any movement in those target areas. And if there's any strikes from the Houthis, I'm pretty sure the Ravens will be in the Super Bowl, that there will be restrikes by the U.S.
So we're not quite done, most
We're not quite done. But their eyes in the sky are monitoring what's going on in Yemen right now.
That area,
yes, it's pretty easy to see if you've got our sensors.
We love it when you cross the river from the Pentagon to come see us on Bloomberg Sound On. Thank you, Tony Capaccio. Great work, great reporting.
Thank you.
Find him on the terminal and online. You can read a lot more about what happened last night as we reassembled our panel for their take. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us. I've been waiting to ask you, Jeannie, about this violation of the Constitution, as Ro Khanna calls it, as Pramila Jayapal calls it, as Mike Lee, the Republican from Utah, calls it. Does the president have a political problem on his hands here beyond geopolitics? I mean, here at home, they say he should have requested authorization from Congress.
Yeah, I mean, this is the long-standing debate. I don't think that is going to morph, at least at this point, into the biggest political problem he has. But he does have a political problem on this. Not only is it creating these strange bedfellows, but he has the same problem he has, quite frankly, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian war. The Houthis have tied what they are doing, despite the fact they've been doing it since 2015, to what has happened in Israel and in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip with the Palestinians. And that's why we're seeing the pushback we are from the far left. And then, of course, you have the Mike Lees of the world. That's a political problem to a certain extent for the president. But of course, they feel they had no option but to respond, because a bigger problem they feel would be economic disruption. And that's what they are responding to.
Rick, you've talked to us before about the importance of presidential powers. If President Biden went to Congress to get some sort of authorization together, would that have just simply delayed things, or should he have done it?
Oh, there's no question that it would have delayed things, and it would have broadcast even more than we already did our intentions. And so no telling how many of the facilities that we bombed would have already been moved and shut down. And so our ability to degrade things like anti-aircraft missile launchers and things like that, that keep our service members safe by taking out would have been put at risk. So the president did the right thing. It's probably been exactly the same methodology used by every president in the last century when it comes to dealing with hostility like this. We're not declaring war on the Houthis. We are trying to solve for interruptions in commercial navigation in that part of the world. And we are already seeing the impact of the disruptions at the hands of the Houthis. I mean, Tesla factories in Germany are waiting for materials that have now been sent around the Horn of Africa and delaying the supply chain. So this ripple effect of what happens in the Red Sea is going to impact supply chains all over the world, and that's bad for the world economy. So the reality is the Houthis are on the wrong side of commercial activity in every region of the world.
It's pretty remarkable, Jeannie. This is real life stuff. To see a president who's spent the last 2 years trying to fight inflation now actually using the military to keep supply chains intact. This is where we're at.
That's right. And you know, he has no choice in that regard but to do this, because we are just, I mean, your conversation yesterday, the economy, their feeling is starting to turn around. Consumer, you know, confidence is on the rise. Inflation is down. Unemployment is down. The last thing they want to do is have this problem with the supply chain. So that is a major concern, obviously, and should be of the president. Politically, the ramifications if the economy goes south are enormous for him. But I also think politically is important in this regard is what you raised about Secretary Lloyd Austin. I think that has a potential to play in the election as well. There is concern about the way that this was done in communications from the Pentagon, and that can reach up to the president, who many people already feel is not in charge the way he should be. To have somebody AWOL for that many days is problematic for him.
Only got a minute here, Rick. Do you want to weigh in on that? Should the Pentagon have kicked out a photograph? I know, yeah, we hear all about the secretary's privacy here, but if he's actually orchestrating this, or if he's providing operational direction from a hospital bed, should we see a photograph of that room?
Yeah, I don't know if you need a photograph of a patient's room, but you need clear communication on the nature of the situation with the secretary. I mean, he serves the people of the United States. He's a staff person for the president, and the fact that he has been out of touch at such an incredibly important time is completely unacceptable. And this is not, you know, a option. This is a obligation to inform the American people of the status of the Secretary of Defense. And so I wish everyone would quit worrying about like his personal views. Look, we all hope he gets better. The sooner he gets out of the hospital, the better. But we have a right and an obligation on their part to inform the public of what's going on. I mean, this is outrageous, and the president should not stand for it.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. We're going to hit the campaign trail coming up next, ahead of what appears to be the coldest Iowa caucus on record. They're canceling campaign activities. They're canceling flights. But the latest poll shows that the Nikki Haley surge remains intact. We'll get to that after world and national news now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. President Biden, as you've been talking about, faces a big test of his ability to avert a wider war in the Middle East following U.S.-led airstrikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen. Wendy Schiller of Brown University's Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy says it could be tough for Republicans to criticize this move.
Let's remember, President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, the one that was negotiated by the Obama administration. And so Trump always took a very hard line on Iran. It's going to be very difficult for any Republican to criticize Biden on trying to thwart these Iranian proxy attacks. So in that sense, politically, I think he's quite insulated.
Wendy Schiller of Brown University speaking on Bloomberg Daybreak. Stormy weather has forced the cancellation of more than 1,700 U.S. flights so far today. That's according to FlightAware. Chicago airports are being impacted with snow, and on the East Coast, where flooding posed a problem earlier this week, Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says residents should expect another deluge this weekend.
Low pressure will race up into the Great Lakes states this evening. It's going to produce quite a bit of rain from the mid-Atlantic and the southern New England into New York City, then across the Gulf Coast and southeastern United States. In fact, along the Gulf Coast and in parts of the southeast, there could be some strong thunderstorms.
Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow lower, but the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, they are all moving higher right now. Back in the green, the Dow down 114, drop there of 0.3%. S&P higher by 4, that is a gain of 0.1%. NASDAQ up 8, a gain of 0.1%. NASDAQ 100 index up 14, that is a gain of 0.1%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares remains in the red, down by 0.1%. 10-year at 3.96%, the 2-year 4.16%. Treasury 2-year yields hitting the lowest since May as an unexpected decline in producer prices reinforces bets on Federal Reserve rate cuts this year. Spot gold up $17 the ounce, up 0.9%. Bitcoin now down 6%. 43,370 on Bitcoin, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is up 1.2%, 72.91 a barrel. Inflation appears to be ebbing at the wholesale level, but Red Sea ship attacks could have an impact in the weeks ahead. With that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Producer prices fell for a third month in December, running counter to a pickup in household costs. Wholesale prices dropped across the board, from food to energy, adding to evidence the Federal Reserve will soon cut interest rates. However, Houthi commando and rocket attacks on tankers and freighters in the Red Sea are forcing delays and detours, adding to import costs. Oil prices rose after U.S. and U.K. airstrikes on the Houthis. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And again, we got West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.2%. Oil stocks are pushing higher as well. ExxonMobil, case in point. Exxon right now up by 1%. ADR of BP up 0.6%. Chevron up now by 1.2%. Recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P higher up 3, a gain of just under 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
They say the momentum is behind Nikki Haley in New Hampshire. How about Iowa? The latest poll here from Suffolk University draws the headline in the Washington Post that she's been waiting for. Haley tops Ron DeSantis for the first time in Iowa poll. This is the same group, by the way, that had her about 20 points behind Donald Trump in New Hampshire earlier this week. Topping Ron DeSantis here, let's look at the numbers. And to be clear, Donald Trump is still far out in front, as you might expect, 54%. These are likely caucus goers, not a huge pool, but an important one. 500 likely caucus goers give 54% to Trump as their first choice. Haley, second choice at 20%. Ron DeSantis at 13%. No point in mentioning Vivek in single digits. Just last month, Ron DeSantis was leading Nikki Haley in the state. An important move here. It's not just New Hampshire, as it turns out. Leading Nikki Haley to ask the question openly today, who's your daddy, Ron? A new ad up this morning in Iowa. Got this in my hands from Rick Davis, as a matter of fact. Interspersing the crowd chant with bits of an old ad. This is years old, 2018. Ron DeSantis talking to his baby about how great Donald Trump is. The title, yes, who's your daddy?
Make America great again. Build the wall.
Super PAC ad, $1.6 million ad buy. So I suspect we'll see it when we get there, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Rick, is this good politics?
Yeah, well, it's certainly entertaining politics for the rest of us. But look, I mean, a lot of these caucus events have been canceled for the weekend because of the really extreme weather in Iowa. And what better way to try and keep campaigning by having really entertaining ads like "Who's your baby?" You know, for caucus goers to talk to each other over all weekend long. So I think the timing was great, and it's about time we had a little levity in this campaign.
At the end of the spot, a message says, "America needs strength, Jeannie, not a suck-up." Is that the closing argument from Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I think it's a big one for her. I think it's also an argument about electability against Joe Biden is a big one she's been making. But, listen, her numbers have been moving in the right direction all this time. That's why she got the AFP on her side. They are well entrenched in Iowa. We're seeing the big ad money come out there. But again, I hate to go back to Chris Christie, but when he said she might get smoked, you look at these polls and yes, she's moving in the right direction. But Real Clear Politics in Iowa still has Trump up by an enormous amount. So she's got a lot of ground to go, but at least a strong second could move her into New Hampshire to make a go of this.
What's your take on the poll here from Suffolk, Rick? By the way, we're going to talk to David Paleologos coming up in about 15 minutes from Suffolk, who ran this poll. Do the numbers ring true? Is Ron DeSantis coming in third here?
Yeah, I think the directional signals of these numbers ring true. I mean, it's so hard to gauge how many caucus goers are going to go out and what the actual number is going to be. I'd say two things are really important. One is Haley comes in ahead of Ron DeSantis, and this poll indicates that is the direction it's headed in. And two, that Donald Trump, to make this a campaign, gets below 50%. Now, that's probably more a factor of turnout. If he has a smaller turnout than is expected, that could depress his vote a little bit. But look, let's face it, he was going to win Iowa at the beginning, middle, and end. He's never been threatened in Iowa by any of these candidates. But Haley's campaign is all about New Hampshire. She needs an extra spurt of momentum to come into New Hampshire next week, and a second place finish in Iowa will give her that.
All right, so maybe I should have asked that slightly differently, Jeannie. If Ron DeSantis does come in third, is he done?
I don't see where he goes from Iowa. Quite frankly, Joe, even if he won, it would be hard for him to go to New Hampshire and move to South Carolina. Wow. But if he comes in third, I think the writing is clearly on the wall. He has spent millions of dollars and been going down in the polls. I think his campaign realizes that. They've been saying that quietly. I think this is the end for Ron DeSantis, even in the best case scenario. I think for Nikki Haley, we got to look at those 5 counties that Rubio won in 2016. She's got to have a showing there because at this point, Trump is threatening to win all 99. And I think the one I watch is Sioux City to see how he does there. But, if he was to get, to Rick's point, over 50%, if he was to win all 99, I mean, this is a historic victory if it pans out that way. If he doesn't, by the way, gosh, it's hard to listen to these polls because they can be wrong a few percentage points, but wrong 20 or 30 points, and that's a problem for the industry.
Well, you know who's in New Hampshire today? No one we've mentioned yet this hour, Joe Manchin, holding a series of public events in some of Rick Davis's favorite towns like Derry and, of course, Manchester, hosted by a group called Americans Together. This is a nonprofit founded by Joe Manchin's daughter, seeking to raise $100 million to promote centrist candidates. He's pushing for open primaries, Rick, and ranked choice voting. What else is he really up to here? Is he pushing for a third-party run?
Yeah, look, maybe he's auditioning for this no labels thing, trying to keep relevant in the national eyes. I mean, obviously, he's not been in the news as much as when he was, holding up big pieces of legislation in the Senate. Yeah, I mean, I think you got to go where the eyeballs are, and right now that's Iowa, New Hampshire, and there's nothing for him to do in Iowa, but New Hampshire is certainly ground zero for a group like No Labels. So we'll see. I mean, maybe he's threatened by the fact that Chris Christie seems to be the darling of New Labels today. And, so, I mean, who knows what the politics of that group are? You got to get the third way guys in here and have them talk about that.
We're going to do that, absolutely, because I suspect heads are exploding on the Democratic side of the aisle every time Joe Manchin walks into a place like New Hampshire. God knows we've seen that movie already. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano stay with us for some final thoughts on the weather here. The DeSantis camp is praying for snow. Would it actually help the governor of Florida? We'll talk about it ahead. And as I mentioned, David Paleologos will join us alongside Kaylee Lyons coming up at the top of the hour with more on the research from the ground in Iowa. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Citigroup says it's going to be eliminating 20,000 roles, 5,000 managers, in a move that will save it as much as $2.5 billion as part of CEO Jane Fraser's quest to boost the Wall Street giant's lagging returns. But is Fraser moving too slowly? That question this morning for CFRA bank analyst Ken Leone on surveillance.
The analysts generally are very positive about Citi. I still look back to Wells Fargo with Charlie Scharf, and that took 5 years to really get to where they are today. So I think it's the right strategy, but I think there's a bit of optimism of how well this will work quarter to quarter in 2024.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Citigroup shares are advancing right now after earnings this morning. Citigroup up now by about 2.1%. JP Morgan after earnings up 0.2%. Wells Fargo after earnings down 3.2%. Bank of America down by 1%. Sources say Universal Music Group, the record company behind Taylor Swift and Drake, plans to cut hundreds of jobs in the first quarter of the year. ADRs of Universal Music Group, they are trading higher now, up by about 1.5%. We've got health insurance stocks dropping after industry leader United Health Group reported higher medical expenses than investors anticipated. UNH down 3.7%. Those are our top company stories, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington with an eye on Iowa today. The snow is still coming down. We're going to look at how brutal this might be for the candidates and for the caucus goers, and who might actually benefit from the winter weather. Ahead with our signature panel, First World and National News with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. The Houthis are promising a counter move following those overnight strikes on Houthi targets that were carried out by the U.S. and British air forces. The attacks were in retaliation for the Houthis escalating their shipping attacks in the Red Sea. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman has more from Washington.
The airstrikes were aimed at Houthi missile launch sites, but not at military leaders, former senior U.S. intelligence official Norman Rule said in a Bloomberg interview.
It certainly will degrade Houthi capabilities. It is unlikely to deter the Houthis from future attacks, although the Houthis will likely calibrate those attacks in discussion with Iran to prevent a more significant regime-destabilizing response.
Rule said the Houthis have acquired powerful missiles from Iran, which brought them to Iran for training in their use. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
House Speaker Mike Johnson is going against those on his right flank and sticking with the spending deal he made with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Our top-line agreement remains. We are getting our next steps together, and we are working toward a robust appropriations process. So stay tuned for all of that to develop. Thank you.
The decision makes the risk of a government shutdown a little less likely, but it does put Johnson's job at risk. At least 2 ultra-conservatives say they are considering ousting him. The deal that Johnson struck with Schumer caps spending at $1.66 trillion, which is at least $70 billion more than what the House Freedom Caucus members and their ultra-conservatives want. The Oregon Supreme Court is declining to hear a challenge seeking to keep Donald Trump off the Republican primary and general election ballots. The court said in a statement today it expects that the U.S. Supreme Court will resolve the dispute. The Supreme Court has said it will review a Colorado Supreme Court ruling that concluded Trump did engage in insurrection by inciting the January 6th Capitol riot and therefore gave up his right to run for president again. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
All right, Nancy, thank you. I got to be careful here because Kaylee's coming in the studio. I'm just looking at the forecast. I don't want to upset anybody. Des Moines Airport, south side, we got 6.1 inches right now. North side of the airport has 7.2 inches. The winds are blowing. What do we have? Let's see here. The forecast for Caucus Day, a high of -4. And there are real worries about turnout here. This isn't just a funny snow story. A lot of people have to leave their houses on Monday night in very cold places in Iowa, go into gymnasiums and church basements and caucus for their candidates. And we find the headline on the terminal, DeSantis aide sees Arctic blast helping campaign odds. DeSantis himself says, yeah, we got the ground game. Our people show up.
We have a lot of people that we have signed up to commit to for us over many months. I think they're motivated, they're passionate, and they're going to show up. What about the broader electorate? I just don't know, but I'm confident our people are going to come out strong.
DeSantis' deputy campaign manager saying at an event hosted by Bloomberg News in Des Moines, I wish I had been there. For an unprecedented weather event, he says, I think we're best equipped to handle that. Final thoughts from Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, both of whom are making a beeline for Iowa this weekend. Rick, how does this work? How do you weather a storm like this or make it actually work for you?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's pretty much what he said. The question is he going to be able to pull it off? And that is, when you spend all this money and all this time in Iowa building an organization, you hope that organization is sort of your soft landing for bad weather like this. So, you know all the people who are going to vote for you in advance. You know where they live. You can drive out to help them. You can get them an SUV. You can call them up that day. That's the difference between DeSantis and Nikki.
They have 1,600 caucus captains in place, he says, Jeannie. You mentioned it earlier. Could DeSantis win?
I don't think so, but if he did, Joe, imagine Donald Trump's fury. He would have to blame the weather gods or something on the fact that this all went up in smoke. So who knows?
That's all right. You can fix that with a Sharpie. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, thank you. I'll meet you both in Des Moines. Kaylee's coming in next. Hour 2 of Sound On starts now.
From our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Nikki Haley tops Ron DeSantis in Iowa. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On, with new polling from the Hawkeye State showing momentum for Haley now, just 3 days to go. We're going to talk about it with the man behind the poll, David Paleologos at Suffolk University. The political scientist and pollster will be with us in just a moment as we bring Kaylee Lines into the conversation. I hope you were blocking your ears when I talked about the weather.
I was not.
But I'll tell you what, it's going to be part of the game here when we touch down in Iowa, Kaylee. Nikki Haley, the story until now has been New Hampshire, but it's looking like Iowa is starting to turn in her direction. Not that she's going to beat Donald Trump, but it does not look great for Ron DeSantis.
It doesn't, and there's a question of how much longer his campaign can go or will go if he isn't able to secure that number 2 spot in the Hawkeye State. But to your point on Nikki Haley, what kind of number does she need to put up in order to make New Hampshire actually something she might be able to capture? I think that's the question we all have.
That's true. A second place finish just in principle might be enough, you tend to think, since she has really invested in New Hampshire. But let's look at these numbers here. Donald Trump, 54%. Then it's Haley at 20 and DeSantis at 13. So we have to be obviously realistic about who's really winning this race.
We're talking a massive margin. Again, we're all presuming that Trump is going to come out on top in Iowa. But Trump presumes that too. And I wonder what kind of performance he needs to actually see in order to be satisfied and feel like he still has this nomination in the bag.
You see, by the way, he just called the rally for
I did, Manchester.
Next Saturday in Manchester. Are we going?
Hopefully we'll have an easier time getting there than we might have getting to Iowa
tomorrow. We'll be there
tomorrow.
for that. They might cage us, though. I think that's what happened last time I was at a Trump rally in Manchester. All right, David Paleologos is on the way in, as I mentioned, from Suffolk. Let's get started on Wall Street. As always, though, to New York with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew, and we have got just about 2 hours to go until the closing bell, with the Dow lower, S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all in the green right now. 6-point advance for the S&P, up 0.1%. S&P is on track for a winning week. Treasury 2-year yields have hit the lowest since May as an unexpected decline in producer prices this morning reinforced bets on Federal Reserve cuts this year. 10-year yield, 3.96%. The 2-year, 4.15%. Spot gold up 0.9%, 20.47 the ounce. Bitcoin now down 6.1%, 43,324 on Bitcoin. Energy higher. Tensions in the Middle East. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.2%. Right now, WTI 72.90 and Brent crude 78.52, up by 1.4%. Just about 2 weeks away from the next Fed meeting amid speculation about the timing of Fed rate cuts. After that, it is on to the March meeting. Now, Fed officials have been playing down prospects for cuts at the March meeting, and Priya Misra, portfolio manager at JP Morgan Investment Management, agrees.
Now, I think March is a little too soon, and I think the reason why the market's a little wobbly is, number one, we had a really strong fourth quarter, right? We had significant outperformance across asset classes. Some of this is we need more data. Some of it is nervousness around how quickly will the Fed start to cut. I think the market might be a little too optimistic in terms of looking for the first rate cut in March.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Boeing is being sued by those passengers on that Alaska Airlines flight that was forced to make an emergency landing in Portland, Oregon last week after a midair blowout of a so-called door plug on the 737 MAX 9 jet. Shares of both companies are lower. Boeing down now by 2.1%. Alaska is tumbling by 5.1%. Recapping, S&P higher by 6, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. The Friday edition, we meet you at the threshold of the weekend alongside Kaylee Lines with new numbers to talk about here. It's not just New Hampshire. We're looking at momentum behind Nikki Haley in Iowa. Look no further than Suffolk University with the poll. 54% Donald Trump. And Kaylee, it's important. This is, I guess, a relatively small sample, but it's a really important one because we're talking likely caucus goers here, not just registered voters or adults or whatever. Trump 54, Haley 20, DeSantis 13. Do I mention Vivek at this point? Do we still do this?
Well, he's
still
been
in the
spending
race.
a lot of time there.
And he's deeply invested in Iowa. He has 6%.
Yeah.
Which is not great for him here.
And Chris Christie still was in this race at this point, but we know he's gone. I'm not sure he makes much of a difference in Iowa, though.
No, that's a fair point. I'm just wondering where David Paleologos found Asa Hutchinson. What's going on here? I don't even see him on the chart. He's the director of the Suffolk University Political Research Center. I'm sorry to be a wise guy, David. It's great to see you. And welcome back to Bloomberg. It's been too long. Look, I associate you probably because of geography and our time spent in Boston with New Hampshire politics this time of the cycle. But you're looking at Iowa with a very compelling story for Nikki Haley. What did you find?
Yeah, and the polling is a little bit different than others who have done the same polling. Most of the other pollsters have either DeSantis in second place or at even. We found that Nikki Haley was at 20%, clearly above, but within the margin of error, actually, of DeSantis at 13%. And when you remove Christie from the, because we did ask second choice votes, when you remove Christie, it's 54 to 22. She bumps up a couple points. So, but it's still a 30-plus point win. I mean, one thing we know is that Donald Trump is far, far outside on the bell curve of the margin of error. He will win Iowa. The question is second place. We believe it's Haley's right now. Others say it might be tied or DeSantis may prevail.
Well, David, as Joe said, those individuals you were talking to, surveying here, are likely caucus goers. And I wonder which groups of caucus goers may become less likely to actually attend a caucus given the weather. Is it Trump supporters who, based on polling, may assume he has this in the bag that might not actually turn out on Monday?
Yeah, it's a great point. There are two schools of thought on that. One is the poll margin is so high that why bother in 40 below weather? Why bother going to the caucus? Trump's going to win. It's a foregone conclusion. The pollsters probably are in the general ballpark of what the margin is. The other school of thought is the history of the Iowa caucuses. It's never been more than a 12-point margin for anyone in the Iowa caucuses. So what we're talking about is a historic win in Iowa, far, far beyond what any
Iowa caucus result has looked like, and that these are people who have strong intensity for Trump. And if it was 100 degrees below, they would be out there for Trump. So we'll see what happens. There's no way that we can measure that. We do know from other polling that Trump voters have a higher intensity to vote, and they have a less probability of changing their mind. That might work in his favor, or people may assume he's going to win, and it may work against him with the polling.
You polled in New Hampshire just last week, Trump 46, Haley 26. That 20-point spread got a lot of attention, David. And I wonder what happens in Iowa will inform what takes place in New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, a lot of people who were DeSantis supporters were yelling at me on social media for having heard. And I felt like saying, but I didn't want to engage them. You should be happy that I have Haley second and him third, because if he exceeds that, you're going to look like a hero. If he's tied with her or if he beats her. Because it's always about the perception, not the reality. It doesn't matter that someone's going to lose to Donald Trump by 30 points. What matters is what the expectation level is in. And I think the Suffolk poll was beginning, because it got so much attention, was beginning to shape people's opinions that Haley would be finishing second instead of DeSantis. And that sets up for a good opportunity for DeSantis to dispel that, even at our expense, to dispel that narrative.
Well, and that's why so many people are asking if DeSantis, having invested so much in Iowa, if he's not able to pull out number two, if he ultimately leaves the race after Iowa, doesn't even make it to New Hampshire. I know when you released the New Hampshire polling, you pointed out specifically in the release the boost that Chris Christie exiting the race would provide to Nikki Haley. What would happen if DeSantis left the race in the days between Iowa and that first in the nation primary?
So a DeSantis defection would slightly help Trump, but not by much. It's close to a 50-50 split in New Hampshire among second choice votes. So he really wouldn't fare into it. Trump might actually get a small bump if DeSantis were to get out. But Christie, on the other hand, 49% of people who were Christie voters said that they would vote for Haley, and only 7%, I believe, it was like a 7-1 margin, would vote for Trump. Now, some people wouldn't vote at all. Some people would be undecided and so on. But that potentially takes a 15, 20-point race, which is what it is right now, going into the race with Christie in, and changing that dynamic so that it's potentially, I don't know, a 8-9 point lead for Trump in New Hampshire if you sort of interpolate the difference between the Christie votes rolling and rotating to Haley.
We just saw Donald Trump announce a rally for next Saturday night in Manchester, and this has been his MO. I think it's happened the last two New Hampshire primaries, typically on the eve at the big arena across the street on Elm Street from where all the media will be located. It turns into a big sort of carnival atmosphere. And David, considering that so many voters in New Hampshire like to make up their mind at the last minute, I wonder what kind of impact that event will have this time.
I would say it's going to have a marginal impact. It may be reported differently, but the undecided is really low. 92% of Trump voters say they're not going to change their mind. Overall, 80% of all voters say they're not going to change their mind. The undecided is only 4%. In New Hampshire, when you have high undecideds like 20%, 15 to 20%, that's when you see major fluctuations and major shifts using momentum as an impetus to help one candidate or another candidate. I mean, the question to me is, let's say, assume that many of Christie's votes rotate to Haley. That puts us at an 8-9% margin. Ramaswamy now becomes a key figure, because if Ramaswamy got out, that would pretty much seal it for Trump, because Ramaswamy, I don't think we had one voter who said that they were Ramaswamy voters who would vote for Haley. It was mostly Trump. So if he were to get out, before New Hampshire, that would seal it for Trump. I don't think he will. I think he's going to stay in it for a while. But he would, the person that we weren't going to talk about in Iowa, he might be more of a player in New Hampshire than we think.
Fascinating.
That actually is really interesting, Joe, as we've been gaming out who is actually going to be left in the field by the time we get to these.
And whether Vivek might be looking to help Donald Trump.
Well, we know that he has probably been the most vocal advocate
of the greatest president of his lifetime.
Competing against. He said he'd leave the ballot in Colorado if Donald Trump wasn't allowed to be on the ballot. Ultimately, we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to decide that. David, on that note, have you talked and have done any polling on the suggestion, what if Trump is convicted of a felony? How that would change votes? Because I feel like that is a dialogue we are starting to hear more about, that some voters do change their minds depending on the outcome of criminal proceedings, even if those proceedings don't necessarily wrap up in time for these early races.
Yeah, not on the national polling as of yet, because there are so many. It's like convicted of what? He's been charged with so many different things. You have to insert what specifically he would be convicted of. Some people may look more seriously at January 6th versus, a civil settlement based on financial documents, that kind of thing. I think that, one thing we do know is that when, every time he's been in court, he's used it as a fundraising opportunity, and he does mobilize supporters and get more donations, the more legal woes that he has, ironically. So I think that's in play as well. I mean, in New Hampshire, what we're looking at from a polling standpoint is how big will the democracy issue be? And I think that's where your question is coming from. Democracy is a winning issue for Nikki Haley. Between her voters and the Christie voters, 2/3 said, among the people who say democracy is the most important issue, which was number 3 in the state in the primary, Haley would have a huge lead over Trump on that issue. But on the top 2 issues, immigration and economy, Donald Trump is in landslide material. I mean, he's winning 3.5 to 1 over Haley among the immigration issue. And I think that's why you're seeing so much centered around immigration in a state like New Hampshire, which is nowhere near a southern border, but that's the issue that people are talking about.
Been interesting to see Social Security and retirement age pop up as an issue, not only because our interview with Nikki Haley is being featured now in a Trump ad that's playing across the Boston and New Hampshire TV markets here, but it came up twice the other night by Donald Trump and by Ron DeSantis. Are voters talking about it?
So we know demographically that New Hampshire is one of the older states in the country, and disproportionately older voters tend to be more Republican voters and younger voters tend to be more Democratic voters. So I think this was a play to the demographics, not only the current polling, but also just the demographics, that if older voters come out strong, that's a big issue for just that sliver of the population age-wise, where they feel like if they don't feel secure on Social Security and Haley is being attacked for that, that might be the thing that pushes them off Nikki Haley and potentially to Donald Trump.
All right, in our final moment here with you, David, as we look ahead to Monday specifically, what will constitute a surprise for you? Knowing everyone's expecting Trump will win, where could the surprise be?
So the surprise would be Trump doesn't win. I mean, that will make us all...
Well, that would be the ultimate surprise, surely.
But short of that, I'm pretty confident he's going to prevail. The only question in my mind is, does he break the record for the Iowa caucuses for the biggest landslide win in the Iowa caucuses with 12 points? That may happen. I mean, our polling says it will happen, but it may not too. It may, people, as the weather, there are so many conditions. But aside from breaking records and a landslide win for Trump, I think Ron DeSantis in a decisive win for second place over Nikki Haley, to me would be the next biggest surprise. If they're tied, the polling is showing it. Right, we believe that it's Haley in second, but if DeSantis won comfortably, over Haley, and that would be
All right.
really bad for New Hampshire.
David Paleologos, come meet us in New Hampshire. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow trading lower right now. The S&P and NASDAQ, they are in the green. S&P right now higher by 6, up 0.1%, on track for a winning week. Dow Industrials right now down 95, decline there of 0.3%. We've got NASDAQ higher by 12, up by about 0.1%. Big move to the downside in Bitcoin today. Bitcoin plunging 5.8%, 43,471 on Bitcoin. 10-year yield 3.95%. The 2-year 4.15%. Gold up $19 the ounce to $2,048, up by 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude traded here in New York up 1.2%, $72.92 a barrel. Brent up 1.5%, $78.55 a barrel on Red Sea tensions. Earnings Friday, Bank Earnings Friday. Citigroup says it's going to eliminate 20,000 roles in a move that will save it as much as $2.5 billion. Citigroup shares are advancing by 1.7%. JP Morgan Chase after earnings up 0.2%. Wells Fargo down 3.1% right now. Bank of America lower now by 0.5%. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. The Dow lower by 111 points, down 0.3, while the S&P is up by 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Keely Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We've talked a lot about one important vote happening in the coming days. We all know it. The Iowa caucuses are on Monday. But, Joe, there's another really important vote that is happening this weekend.
Big
it's in
time.
Taiwan.
That's right. Far from Iowa. And arguably, I don't know, the next most important election around the world in this cycle. That's going to see them happening in a lot of places.
Mostly because it could be crucial in determining not just the future trajectory of Taiwan's relationship with China, but also the U.S.'s relationship with China by extension, knowing how sensitive the Taiwan issue is at this moment when we're seeing such tense relations between the world's two largest economies.
Yeah, so we thought we would break this down a little bit before it happened. It's not on everyone's radar because we've been spending so much time talking about Iowa and New Hampshire debate season and all the rest of it, and we thought we would reach to a real expert who's helped us out with this story in the past.
Yeah, that expert being Craig Singleton. He is from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. So, Craig, it's a three-way race, essentially, we're talking about here. Walk us through what's at stake, depending on who ultimately comes out on top.
Absolutely right. Everyone here in the Beltway is focused on Iowa, but tomorrow, more than 19 million Taiwanese voters are going to head to the polls to pick their next president and their next parliament. And it goes without saying, I think, as you sort of teed up there, that this election carries some pretty serious significance. While domestic issues like inflation and sort of cost of living are going to be critical in this year's election, far and away the paramount concern revolves around Taiwan's relationship with mainland China. And all told, the election is really going to serve as a litmus test for the Chinese Communist Party's political warfare strategy, namely whether Beijing can achieve its stated reunification goals through non-kinetic means alone. And so the stakes really could not be higher.
So we're basically talking about a menu of three candidates here in sort of 3 degrees of separation from China. Which is closest, a more closely aligned, I should say, with U.S. policy right now?
I would say there's probably 2 outcomes to this election, neither of which suggests to me that U.S.-China relations are really going to improve meaningfully in 2024. The ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, if they emerge victorious, and that is after China has portrayed, this election as a vote between peace and war, it's hard to see Xi Jinping, the leader of China, accepting defeat gracefully. And we have to remember, sensitivities are running pretty high in Beijing right now as China confronts a host of domestic and international crises. And so Xi has made very clear recently that, he has a lot of urgency about reunification with Taiwan, perhaps sooner than later. And so I think what that suggests to me is that we could see a pretty serious Chinese overreaction if the ruling party does succeed, which a lot of polls tend to show, although polls can be wrong. If the current ruling party is voted out of power, I think China will meet that reaction sort of with a little bit of a sigh of relief, but it's hardly clear that either of those opposition parties is going to do Beijing's bidding. And that could really lead, I think, China to become frustrated over time. I think what's more frightening about that scenario for the United States, at least, though, is that, China could sort of believe in the event that they can sort of get rid of the ruling party in Taiwan, that they've hit upon this winning political warfare formula, one that expertly blends provocative military action and sort of disinformation and information warfare. And in that case, they would be pretty emboldened to begin deploying that same strategy in other places, including here in the United States, where they are really seeking to sort of meddle already in the upcoming 2024 election in the United States.
Well, that is a frightening proposition, I think, to many as we talk about our own elections. But on the Taiwan election, for just a moment longer, how much is there for Taiwanese voters a real consideration of independence from China? Is that something that they actually want? Are they likely to seek out the candidate who would most be like supportive of that idea, or is that just, you know, the worst case scenario for China that isn't necessarily something that they would like to see realized?
I think long-term voting trends suggest that most Taiwanese voters would prefer the status quo. They're not seeking to poke China in the eye, but they're also increasingly not interested in reunification, and certainly not reunification on China's terms. Those long-term trends are going to be just incredibly frustrating for China. And so this election is particularly important because it could signal whether we see this turn back towards perhaps a slightly more conciliatory approach towards the mainland, or whether the ruling party in power, which has stood up for Taiwanese sovereignty, not independence, but sovereignty, has garnered to stay in power. And I do think that we're going to get a good sense about the average voter sentiment in Taiwan. But I do think that a lot of the talk about independence is largely sort of melodramatic. We haven't seen an indication that Taiwanese voters are pursuing independence, but what they do want is to have a sense of self-determination, and they do want to be able to maintain their democratic system and democratic governance.
We're spending time with Craig Singleton from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's China program. Should the DPP then remain in power, Craig, what kind of a flex might we see from Beijing? You know, another blockade around the island, send a couple of missiles over. What would it look like?
Yeah, like I said, it's hard to imagine Xi Jinping accepting defeat gracefully here. I think an immediate sort of military reaction, probably through increased military exercises and provocative exercises at that, is a strong possibility. We have to remember that the Chinese leadership has made clear how important and monumental this election is. They have thrown the kitchen sink at Taiwan in the last few months in terms of disinformation, military coercion, economic coercion with new trade subsidies and trade restrictions on Taiwanese companies that are reliant on the mainland. And if all of that effort falls short of achieving their political objectives, I would imagine that there's going to be quite a bit of frustration. Whether that veers towards overreaction or miscalculation remains to be seen, but it's certainly a possibility.
Well, especially keeping in mind that we learned just recently, back in November at that summit in San Francisco between Xi Jinping and President Biden, Xi essentially told him, to paraphrase, that they have every intention of Taiwan being reunified with China, that they would prefer it didn't happen with force. How realistic do you think that is something that's going to happen in the near to medium term, say the next 5 years?
You know, it's really difficult to assess. I think ultimately, I believe Xi wants to reunify through all means short of war. But there are a lot of circumstances and conditions in which he might consider using kinetic force. I think at the end of the day, we're spending so much time trying to think through different counter moves of how the Chinese could react without actually just thinking and looking a little bit about what they're saying in real time. You brought up a great point. Xi Jinping has made clear reunification is inevitable, whether the Taiwanese people want it or not. There are real steps here that we can take in Washington to provide the Taiwanese with the defensive military equipment that they need to defend themselves, while also making clear to China that they should probably accept the results of this outcome, and we should vocally be repeating, I think these conversations are happening privately, but not publicly, that the United States doesn't support any unilateral attempts, whether they're from Taiwan or from China, to change the status quo. I think we should be beating that drum publicly as well as privately, not just to reassure the Chinese, but to make clear to the incoming Taiwanese administration that we're watching. And I think that we're eager to help them with their defense, but we're also going to make sure that we stick through our long-term commitments in the region.
We've just got a minute left here, Craig. What does Beijing think of our elections that are about to begin here, the primary cycle, and whether or not Donald Trump becomes the nominee?
You know, last month, the intelligence community here released a declassified assessment that showed that China meddled extensively and pervasively in our midterms in 2022, even getting involved in picking candidates for Congress and undermining those that were perceived as being anti-China. I think what they're going to do in this coming term is more of the same. There's no indication that the Biden administration has called out Chinese election meddling or threatened them with any sort of consequence if they were to repeat repeat that again. But I do think we're going to be very keen to show U.S. democracy is dysfunctional, chaotic, and unreliable. Those are key themes and messages the Chinese are propagating around the world, and I think we can expect that sort of same information warfare theme to be persistent throughout 2024.
Greg, it's great to see you. Thanks for setting us up for this important election in Taiwan. We'd love to hear your thoughts once we get through it. He's senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's China program, and that's, of course, why we call on him, Kayleigh. He sure knows what he's talking about, and I'd be deeply curious to hear how this goes. The ramifications run a lot deeper than a lot of people might realize here. Let's get to world and national news now. Nancy Lyons does that for us. Then the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Yemen's Houthi rebels are vowing to retaliate for American and British strikes against them overnight. The U.S. and the U.K. took aim at more than 60 Houthi targets in 16 locations across Yemen. The bombing was in response to the Houthis' campaign of drone and missile attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. Norman Rule, a former intelligence officer now with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says it's unclear if the situation will now escalate.
We hope it's a one-off, but that's really up to the Houthis. I think what we have to look at is whether a Houthi counter strike will be symbolic, meant to show defiance, or really something that indicates that they haven't got the message. If the latter is the case, there will certainly be a broader strike by the United States, probably the United Kingdom. But again, it'll be carefully calibrated to move up the escalatory ladder.
Again, Norman Rule, who spoke with Bloomberg Surveillance. The Biden administration is rolling out another pathway to debt relief for certain student loan borrowers. The program targets people who took out less than $12,000 as their initial student loan balance and have been paying it down for 10 years. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona outlined the details on ABC's Start Here podcast.
For those who have borrowed either $12,000 or less, after 10 years, they would be receiving loan forgiveness. But we were going to roll that out in July of this year, and eager to do that. But instead, we're going to be rolling it out today.
Again, that's Education Secretary Miguel Cardona. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks trading a little change right now, with the S&P on track for a winning week. Right now it is higher by just 1 point. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 140, a decline there of 0.2%. NASDAQ back in the red, lower by 4, down less than 0.1%, virtually unchanged on the day, as is the NASDAQ 100 index, up now by 1 point. 10-year 3.95%, with a 2-year 4.14%. Treasury 2-year yields hitting the lowest since May, as an unexpected decline in producer prices this morning reinforced bets on Fed rate cuts this year. Bitcoin now down 5.6%, 45,554 on Bitcoin. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, up 0.9%. Crude, a major story today amid Red Sea tensions. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%, 72.58 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, now at 78.22, higher by 1%. BlackRock shares are advancing, up by almost 1%. BlackRock has agreed to buy Adebayo Ogunlesi's Global Infrastructure Partners for about $12.5 billion, vaulting the world's biggest money manager into the top ranks of investors that make long-term bets on energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink spoke about the deal this morning with our David Weston right here on Bloomberg Radio.
I've always looked with envy, with admiration to what Bayo and his team have done. We are both refugees from First Boston. We knew each other at First Boston. We have a common culture.
And again,
we laugh about what we learned at First Boston over dinners.
Yep. BlackRock shares, again, they are higher now by about 0.6%. Recapping stocks now trading flat on the day. S&P 500 index, we're going to call that unchanged. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Countdown to the caucus here. It's official. The last weekend of campaigning and final arguments from the candidates. The problem is, in many cases, they can't get to voters because of the weather. We're still looking at blizzard conditions today in Des Moines and other areas in central Iowa, where the real campaigning is taking place here and will be over the course of the weekend. But Kaylee, it's going to be high winds tomorrow, and then such bitter cold by the time actual caucuses are held on Monday that it could mean shifting strategies for these campaigns.
Yeah, well, certainly Ron DeSantis' campaign has spoken with Bloomberg today, in fact, at an event in Des Moines, and said they think it helps because they have such a built ground game, they say. As we know, he's gone to all 99 counties. But still, when you're talking a wind chill of negative 40.
That's literally the forecast.
How committed are people when they said before they were committed?
Right.
David Weston's about to be with us. David's from Michigan, as we all know.
David knows cold.
David, what's the coldest weather you've ever experienced?
It was 25 or 30 below. I've gone out to try to start a car.
Wind chill or actual?
No, really actual. Really, I've been in weather.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you don't want to do that. By the way, I don't care what the political strategy. I want to know what your strategy, the two of you, are for going out there. How are you going to get out there? I'm not sure. You're going to need a dog sled.
Well, that's true. They're canceling a lot of flights right now, David. But I think the real answer is Kaylee has a strategy, and I do not. She actually has battery-operated gloves.
I do.
I have nothing. You've got the gear. I might be very unprepared here.
I look like Iron Man, but I will be warm, hopefully. As warm as I can be in that kind of weather.
Well, I'll tell you what. We're talking about this campaign from a lot of different angles here, David, and so are you on Wall Street Week. And when we start talking about the contribution that you're making here in terms of Wall Street votes, it's about time we get to this conversation. What do investors think of this, and how are they looking at this differently than some other folks as we head to actual voting?
Well, that's the question we're asking of people in and around Wall Street. We started last week with Larry Summers, and as you'd expect, he thinks it's pretty dire if President Trump gets reelected. But we're going to do this every week. In fact, this week we're going to have two different guests on it. But one of them is Steve Ratner from Willett Advisors, who, of course, has been part of Democratic administrations. But he's a fairly measured guy, and he says with Biden, you'll probably get more of the same. But the really interesting thing is when it comes to President former and perhaps future President Trump. Last time you remember, it was pretty rugged, but actually it came out pretty well for Wall Street. And we asked him about why won't it be just as good this time. This is what Steve had to say.
But you'll remember a lot of us kind of got this wrong. On election night, when it looked like Trump was going to win, initially the market crashed. Then people said, wait a minute, like 3 o'clock in the morning, they said, oh, wait a minute, the market soared up again, and it kind of took off from there, and then you had COVID and whatnot. This time may be more complicated because Trump's policies are not mainstream Republican orthodoxy. He's off in the populist world with all these tariffs, which business hate, with shutting down immigration, which business hates. They need the workers. So I don't know that global Wall Street, and plus all of his anti-democratic authoritarian talk, I think it scares people. And so I'm not sure whether Wall Street will react well to another Trump victory.
So that's the question we're going to try to explore with a range of views here, because there is a tendency to think we know this play, we've seen it before. It may not be quite the same, because you both have seen the reporting I've seen, which is there's been a real effort by the people around Donald Trump to come up with a really pretty thought-out set of policies and some people to implement them. It might be quite different from last time.
Yeah, David, this is really interesting. And I found what Steve Ratner told you there really interesting, because I was actually just with a group of individuals who represent the hedge fund industry earlier this week. And they were talking about how actually, while you used to be able to count on Republicans to be the pro-business types, because of the populism movement, they've actually gotten a lot closer to, say, progressive Democrats. And this is just kind of a circle that is coming to the same place rather than opposite ends of a spectrum. Does that mean to say, though, that a president potentially like Joe Biden getting a second term is necessarily the more optimal outcome for Wall Street than a second Trump term?
Well, I think you used exactly the right word, populism, which is what we're hearing increasingly. Steve talked about populism and saying that Donald Trump would really become even more populist than he was before. But that gets me to our second guest this week, actually, Glenn Hubbard, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush. He'll be on tonight with us live, and I've talked to him before, and he actually thinks there might be more similarity between Donald Trump and Joe Biden than we think because of the rise of populism, when it comes to protectionism, when it comes to dealing with China, when it comes to the independence of the Federal Reserve, particularly as those interest rates go up and our debt burden increases. He's concerned, actually, populism may be there whether it's Republican or Democrat. A different point of view I hadn't heard before.
That's fascinating. Of course, Donald Trump spent so much time tweeting about all-time highs in the stock market and really used that as kind of his own internal poll of his success, David. We now see Joe Biden struggling to crow a little bit about all-time highs. He doesn't like to talk about it, but he did get out there at one point and reference the fact the stock market's looking pretty good, in fact, under his tenure. Does Wall Street look at both candidates the same? When you look through history, in fact, the markets have outperformed a bit more under Democratic administrations than Republican ones, which is counterintuitive to what we normally hear.
Exactly right. And it does strike me as I hear you, Joe, it's a little hard for Joe Biden, Mr. Blue Collar, to embrace the stock market, right? Because he's all bottom up and middle out and all that stuff. For him to all of a sudden say, well, I've got religion, I'm wearing with the S&P, I'm not sure that really rings true to his brand.
Well, we've actually asked Jared Bernstein about this from the White House. I said, hey, I know you like to talk about gas prices a lot, but why not talk about the stock market more? And he was like, well, you know, those are individuals usually that have 401ks and that kind of thing. So I guess it just depends on your audience, David.
Yeah, the main thing I'm hearing, I'm sure you both are hearing as well, is there's sort of a, forget the long and variable lag on monetary policy, there's a lag on perceiving inflation is going down. Inflation clearly is coming down, the rate of increase is coming down, but now there's a lot of work being done on how long does it take for people to really believe that, and whether it's going to get here soon enough to help Joe Biden come November. Because right now, as you know, by and large, the American public are not really pleased with the economic job that this president has done.
Wall Street votes is something we're going to carry through the cycle, right, David? What do we have in store?
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, we're going to keep the effort up. Particularly, we want to bring in right-of-center people because there's a range of views here. And we want to get a dialogue going, a real discussion that digs deep into what the policies might be, how it might affect things. So the people within Wall Street, whatever they want to decide, they're deciding based on some information, and they've thought it through very carefully, kick the tires.
Yeah, I love that. We'll have our first installment of Wall Street Votes from Iowa on Caucus Day, right? David Weston, I'm glad you won't have to shiver with us, but we'll miss you in the heartland.
I'm so sorry not to be there. I'm so sorry.
We'll be in touch, don't worry. The host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week with us here on Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. So Leah Mosen checks in from Iowa next. We'll go to ground in Des Moines, just minutes away. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Boeing is being sued by passengers on an Alaska Airlines flight that was forced to make an emergency landing in Portland, Oregon last week after a mid-air blowout of a so-called door plug on the 737 MAX 9 jet. The suit was filed in Washington State Court by 7 passengers. It does seek class action status and unspecified damages from Boeing, which manufactured the plane. Right now, we have got shares of Boeing. They are down by 2.5%. Alaska Air Group down now by 5.6%. Delta Airlines is backing away from its 2024 profit target. That story from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
Charlie, that's because persistently high costs are apparently countering gains from the rebound that Delta and others are seeing in international travel. In its fourth quarter report, Delta says adjusted earnings will be $6 to $7 a share this year. The company had a long-term profit target for several years running of more than $7 a share for 2024. The revised outlook from Delta shows it's not immune to the elevated costs and other challenges plaguing the industry. That's as supply chain shortages have increased engine repair times and slowed the delivery of some new aircraft. New pilot contracts at 3 of the 4 largest U.S. carriers also pushing up spending for wages and other compensation, Charlie.
And that's Denise Pellegrini. Right now, Delta is down by 8.5%. Citigroup eliminating 20,000 roles in a move that will save it as much as $2.5 billion. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletin. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The forecast for Caucus Day, it's snowing right now in Des Moines. Caucus Day, a high of 4 below zero. We've been obsessing over this because it really could change the ground game and even the results of this Iowa caucus with record cold temps. Bloomberg News reporting today, Kaylee, that the DeSantis camp thinks it can outperform in bad weather because it's got the ground game.
That's what they say, that they've spent so much time invested in the state of Iowa, visiting all 99 counties, signing up all their people.
1,600 captains.
Good to go. That's right. And of course, DeSantis also is touting in Iowa the endorsement of the state's governor,
his best friend,
Kim Reynolds.
That's correct.
And that's actually someone that Bloomberg's very own Saleha Mosin spoke with on Bloomberg's Big Take DC podcast. Saleha is actually already in Iowa, where she's braving the elements before Joe and I have to do...
Good move, Saleha. We don't know if we can get there.
Joe and I are going to have to do the same soon. Saleha, tell us more about your conversation with the governor, and maybe also how cold is it?
Actually, I am stuck in Atlanta right now. I can tell you.
No!
You're making our point.
Yeah, people aren't getting there. I don't know who's going to vote. Let's see what happens and if Iowans can stomach it. But I'm telling you, I spoke to Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. It was her first interview for the year, just a couple of days before Iowans kick off the election year for the country. She spoke to Big Take DC, and she had something really interesting to say about what would happen if Trump is the Republican nominee.
Great, let's listen.
You know, I'm a Republican. Any one of the candidates that we have running will do a better job than the absentee president that we have serving at this point. It is unbelievable what we see happening under this administration. And so without hesitation.
It's fascinating when you consider, Saleha, the Suffolk poll that we just talked to David Paleologos about, showing Nikki Haley moving past Ron DeSantis in Iowa. It's not looking great for his momentum there now, is it?
It's not looking great for his momentum. The interesting thing that Reynolds did say to me during our interview, you have to download and listen, but the interview was interesting. She talked about how if Donald Trump gets less than 50% of Iowans' support, then it is game on for a number 2 candidate to work through the primaries, New Hampshire, Carolina, South Carolina, and then on to Super Tuesday, and maybe break Trump fever.
Did she think that Ron DeSantis was going to be that candidate no matter what, even if he didn't come in? Number 2, did she suggest to you that DeSantis has taken this all the way?
She suggested, she was direct. She says DeSantis is going to win it. DeSantis can win it. He is right for the country. He's right for Iowans. She is full steam ahead supporting Ron DeSantis right now.
Saleha, we've been taking this time each day recently to update the forecast. We go to Des Moines and listen, to like the local TV stations there. This is the top story. KCCI Channel 8. You're in Atlanta right now. Just listen.
Right now, we're just off 235, and this is a very Midwest thing to say, that it's not that cold unless the wind is blowing. Well, the wind is blowing, and it's picking up that snow. It's making it cold. It's making it cold, and it's blowing that snow everywhere. It's causing drifts up the sides of buildings.
Oh my God, this poor lady's on the side of the highway. It's drifting up the sides of buildings, Saleha. What's that going to mean for turnout?
I mean, they had expected Iowan state party local officials had talked about 200,000 Iowans participating in the caucuses, casting ballots, persuading each other, getting persuaded. It is really unclear who is going to make it out. Events are getting canceled left and right in Iowa right now.
Boy, what timing.
And flights, clearly.
And flights, yeah, exactly.
And flights.
That'd be
No
great.
one's
The
landing
weekend is here. Yeah, you can't meet with any voters, and there's no media there to cover it. I love it. We'll cover the Georgia primary at some point. Just stay where you are, Saleha. Hey, we'll meet you there. We're trying to get there tomorrow. Maybe we can actually pull this thing off. We'll meet Saleha in Des Moines and check out the Big Take DC podcast. Subscribe after you do. the Sound On podcast.
Do them both.
Thank you, Saleha. Yeah, well, if you're a political junkie, you need them both.
Yeah.
All right, Kaylee, I'll see you on Balance of Power a little later on Bloomberg TV.
Indeed.
Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
Perfect amount of time.
That was great. That was exactly, I think, what it should have been. Okay. Actually, that's as animated as
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. TGIF, what a week it's been. You are live, or we are, from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. You might be too. Are you under the mic table or something?
I'm here. I'm here. Were you looking for me?
I don't know. It's.
I'm here. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I'm not worried.
Oh, I'm in.
We're on YouTube.
Yeah.
We're on Bloomberg Originals.
We're everywhere.
It is Friday.
We're on the Bloomberg terminal.
Yeah, we were having some tech issues.
I'm fine now.
Are you there?
Hey, yeah, I'm in. I'm in. Don't worry about me. Today,
I always
Carol.
worry about you.
Friday, January 12th.
I care. I'm in too.
Good. All right. Everything is working.
Everything is awesome.
Hey, a lot happening today. Do you feel like this was a pretty packed week? And I'm just talking about Friday.
I actually said to somebody, man, this week has felt like a month. And we're we're halfway, not even quite halfway through January. So a lot going on. And for investors just alone on this Friday, they're reacting to the big bank earnings. We're going to talk about that. An unexpected soft inflation print. And what feels like, once again, heightened geopolitical risk. All of that we have covered.
Yeah, one thing that's funny, though, is we see pretty much no reaction in the S&P 500 right now after bouncing around for quite a bit today. NASDAQ down a little more than 0.1%, while the Dow's down about 0.4%. Hey, one thing of note, U.S. two-year yields hitting their lowest since May on that soft PPI report that you mentioned, Carol.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. We've seen ourselves kind of sitting at that 4% mark for much of the week. Some volatility, though, with that CPI print that came in stronger than expected and showed some signs of inflation concerns. But nonetheless, there we are on that 10-year below that 4% mark. Having said that, we are going to get into the big banks. Citi's disappointing fourth quarter, B of A's profit slump, Wells Fargo's cost surprise, and then there's JP Morgan having its most profitable year in U.S. banking. We've got that roundup for you coming right up.
Also, a roundup on the latest geopolitical actions and tensions and the 5 potential trouble spots that could knock the global economy off course.
Yeah, a bunch of things actually to keep on your radar. Speaking of being off course, check out Boeing now with increased FAA oversight following last week's accident. We're going to tackle that one as well.
Plus, David Weston stops by as he gets ready for Wall Street Week. Carol, he's going to talk about his interview with the head of the world's largest asset manager, that's BlackRock's Larry Fink. The topics were wide-ranging, from the new Bitcoin ETF and big infrastructure bet, earnings, and more, tokenization of assets.
I have to say, both you and I were listening on our way in this morning. It's a really wide-ranging conversation. As you said, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, so we care what Larry Fink has to say and what he's doing. So we'll have more on that and looking forward to that. Right now, though, over to the TV colleagues. Countdown to the close starts now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the Countdown to the Close. I'm Scarlett Fu here with Katie Greifeld. And of course, we want to say hello to our colleagues in radio, Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek, and welcome in
want to
full
say hello.
our Bloomberg audiences across our different platforms. Hey, guys.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi.
Good. Happy Friday to you.
What do you think of my new background?
What is your new background?
It's the window. You're sitting in a
like it?
different chair than usual.
Yeah, different
Is
chair.
it possible that Tim looks more handsome than normal?
Okay. All right, let's
That's
go.
your eyes.
Can I do that?
Let's talk about
Are those
airplanes.
new
HR
glasses?
calling. Having said that, we're all focusing on a lot of things right today. There's a lot going on. Boeing included in that. It's been a big week for Boeing, and not in a good way. But having said that, one of the things actually caught Tim's attention. He loves things that are up in the sky, and this is the possibility of a new supersonic jet that might be coming our way pretty time soon, right, Tim?
Yeah, it's called the X-59. It's made by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. It's set to be unveiled this afternoon in Palmdale, California. And what's interesting about this is it's designed to fly faster than the speed of sound, but not make the same noise that you're used to when you break Mach 1. So instead of hearing that loud sonic boom, which is not so pleasant for people on the ground, Scarlett, it can shatter windows. The X-59 is designed to reach 1.5 times the speed of sound, but has a V-shaped wing and elongated nose, so it doesn't create the same type of sonic boom. So then perhaps in the future, we could be going faster on commercial planes if this technology ends up working.
Okay, that's a key phrase, perhaps in the future, because none of this right now is going to affect any of us in the moment.
Unless we're on the ground in
the airline
California.
industry does need some good news today.
And they're going to do a test flight this year, and, you know, we won't hear a sonic boom. You're right, this is years away.
How long? How far?
I mean, we don't even know. They have to do a test flight this year. But if the tech works, and look, you know, we've had passenger planes that have broken the sound barrier, the Concorde, but they stopped flying that back in 2003 for a whole host of issues. But if you want to go faster in a plane, this is the way to do it.
I want to hear a sonic boom just once. Just once, I'd like to know what it sounds like.
Checklist, bucket list?
Yeah, you know, that's on my wish list. Let's talk about Taylor Swift. And when I say let's talk about Taylor Swift, let's talk about the Chief Dolphins game, because apparently tickets, they're plunging below $37 per ticket, because where they're playing it in Arrowhead Stadium, it's going to be below freezing. So really tells you how quickly demand can plummet there. I'm really excited to see, though, if Taylor Swift does attend this game. I think that would be a really important sort of mark as to how serious this relationship is.
It can survive cold temperatures.
Forget the consequences for the NFL standings or the championship.
Well,
right?
I do have a size and scope for you. By kickoff around 7 p.m. local time, the temperature is forecast to drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's going to be very, very cold.
Wait, wouldn't she be in one of those like closed-in booths where it's warm, the drinks flow, and
it's very insulated.
Listen, symbolism is important.
This is a buy on the rumor, sell on the news kind of thing, isn't it?
Are we talking about spot Bitcoin ETF?
No, we are not.
I'm told that this is kind of a controversial game because Peacock has the exclusive rights to it.
Yes. We were just talking about that.
So in order to watch it, you have to be a subscriber to Peacock. So I think a lot of people are not so happy about that, who are just used to turning on the TV and watching football, Katie.
Yeah, perhaps. I will say, if this was in New Jersey, I would probably go. For $37, like that, I'd probably go to.
Even if the weather were if it's this cold?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Definitely
just back on the
She would make her way to some kind of luxury box, so, you know.
I'd be okay,
So
Tim,
wait,
trust me, it'd be fine.
We've missed the most important point. Does that mean this is over, this relationship?
No, we just have to see if she shows up.
What rumors are you starting
Easy here.
Have you ever listened to her music?
Constantly.
All right, everybody. We'll be back in less than an hour's time. We're going to wrap up. What a crazy week. What a long week. What a busy week. But we're going to wrap up the Friday trade. We'll see you at 4 p.m. Wall Street time, radio, TV, YouTube, and, of course, Bloomberg Originals. Beyond the Bell. Make sure you big banks and financial firms this week and this morning specifically, Friday. Net, the highlights include Citi's disappointing fourth quarter. You had B of A's profit slump, Wells Fargo's costs coming in higher than expected, and then, Tim, there was JP Morgan Chase.
Yeah, that's right. JP Morgan Chase having its most profitable year when it comes to U.S. banking. As of note, Carol, a big news out of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, doing a huge deal, buying Global Infrastructure Partners, a GIP. We're going to hear about that later on. We're going to have David Weston stop by. He caught up with Larry Fink about that in BlackRock's earnings. AUM for BlackRock swelling to just over $10 trillion. That one is above estimates.
Pretty impressive. Right now, the KBW Bank Index down about 0.8%. Let's get to it. Lots of news. Menden Capital Advisors President and Chief Investment Officer Anton Schutz with us, along with Bloomberg News Wall Street reporter Sonali Basak, whose notes on earnings as they were crossing, I was reading in, walked the dogs, got my coffee, reading Sonali's notes. They were must-reads for us this morning. Great to have you guys here with us. Sonali, let's start with you. Highlights, lowlights.
I thought that the credit quality story was really interesting because you
Interesting, good or bad?
Not good.
Okay.
Well, only in the sense that on one hand, when you see these charge-offs start to rise or credit quality start to weaken a little bit, on one hand, yes, it does signal some weaknesses in the consumer, but it also shows you that the banks are willing to lend into that weakness. So, for example, Citigroup said that their net charge-off rate will be between 3.5 and 4%. We're already heading into levels above pre-pandemic. And JP Morgan said that theirs will be below 3.5%, which is less than Citigroup's. But again, they're looking to increase net interest income once again. And that $90 billion projection that they gave for this full year implies 6 rate cuts this year. So if you see less, there is a chance that JP Morgan makes more money next year than it did this year in net interest income.
Does the credit quality issue, Shonali, have you concerned about the economy?
It has me very curious about what the next week looks like with regional banks and credit cards. So fun fact, last year, Capital One stock rose more than 40%, while Bank of America's rose less than 2%. And so people have loved these credit card businesses. But we're heading into a point in the economy where delinquencies are starting to rise, and they're rising above those levels from pre-pandemic. So, and honestly, you know, buy now, pay later loans, they're not calculated in your FICO score. So there are a lot of questions about the consumer right now.
All right, let's bring in Anton Schutz, who has been following the bank sectors, or bank sector, I should say, for a long time. Anton, and we love, you know, reaching out to you. What's your net on the results we got today? And you join us, of course, on Zoom in Florida.
Yeah, well, I think it was really a mixed bag. I mean, the stocks had really ripped, you know, into these numbers. Fourth quarter was a pretty large, powerful move. A lot of it was driven by short covering because, you know, bank failures did not continue. The credit disaster hasn't happened. Commercial real estate is not good, but it isn't destroying the banks. So, you know, I think the Fed, you know, pivoting has really been a big factor. Clearly, people have picked on their securities books because, you know, they bought a lot of long-term bonds, helped fund our giant deficit, and they got paid back by having terrible marks on those books. But at the end of the day, you know, that's no longer a story. People aren't focusing on that this minute. And I think these numbers were just good enough. You know, no major move in the index today. I mean, you had Citibank up because, you know, people are looking at the future, even though the numbers weren't great today. JP Morgan's numbers were probably the